Chapter 149. Near the center of the Project Hunt Island, there was a gathering of not-so-inconspicuous youths taking place. Some were looking toward one another with vigilance and hostility that could hardly be concealed. If one could set aside the peculiarity of the atmosphere, the surroundings itself was quite beautiful. Many lakes, rivers, and rolling hills could be seen. The only issue was that it all seemed quite unnatural. It felt impossible that such a scenery could be formed organically. It was almost like a painter laid down a fantasy world on their canvas, only for it to somehow pop up and become a reality. The rivers wound in and out of the lakes like ribbons of water flowing as they pleased. Some of them didn't even take the green hills as obstruction, crawling up their sides and falling down the other in small waterfalls. It really was a beautiful sight. But, it seemed that none of the youths had the mind to care about such things as they looked toward each other with vigilance. Roaring Black Lion stood to one side, his gaze practically spitting fire as he looked toward a group of 3 youths. There were numerous wounds across his body, making it obvious that Lionel wasn't the only one having a hard time during this hunt. But, judging by the hostility in his gaze, it was obvious that while Lionel was suffering at the hands of a beast, it seemed that he had suffered at the hands of his fellow man. It wasn't just him who had such wounds and carried such animosity. Aside from chasing wind, whose indifference was maybe somewhat obvious considering the speed at which she could escape, they all had such gazes, even Thunder's Clap. Towards such eyes, Pisces, Flowing Wind, King of Seas and the rest of the Eastern Lookout youths could only chuckle. Who asked the Southern Lookout promising youths to be stupid enough to travel alone? If it wasn't for this, would they have suffered such obvious losses? Of course, there was one group amongst the Eastern Lookout fellows that didn't seem to be having such a great time. However, rather than having their eyes trained on a particular person, they were constantly scanning the surroundings as though trying their best to find their prey. I know I'm beautiful, but is there a need to stare at me so intently? Flowing Wind blinked her eyes and brought her elbows together, winking flirtatiously at Roaring Black Lion and Thunderous Clap, both of whom had suffered due to her. The action was really too provocative. She was hardly wearing much to begin with. Now with this, it felt as though all her assets might pop out at any time. Thunderous Clap didn't even spare her a glance, but Roaring Black Lion looked her up and down. Despite the rage in his eyes not dispelling, it seemed he was perfectly fine with enjoying the show. And why not? He didn't have to turn a blind eye to her beauty just to get his revenge, right? He would teach her a lesson regardless. If you want to look some more, I don't mind. But you'll have to get a little closer. Flowing Wind said sweetly. I wouldn't mind coming closer, but you look a bit fragile. I might accidentally snap you half. Oh. But that's exactly what I want. Flowing Wind blinked with expectation as though hoping Roaring Black Lion would cross the distance between them at that very moment. She looked every bit the part of a woman who couldn't wait a moment longer. However, the underlying murderous intent was clear to the point that if one closed their eyes and only focused on her words and not her tantalizing figure, it would sound as though she was inviting you to the depths of hell rather than her bed. That said, Roaring Black Lion didn't seem to notice as he took numerous broad steps forward. In a moment, he was so close to Flowing Wind that her ample chest just barely grazed along his ribcage. She stood with her hands on her hips, looking up at Roaring Black Lion with an expectant glint in her eye. Just when it seemed that the atmosphere might take a turn for the worse, the sound of shuffling grass and a snapping twig sounded. Many looked over to find a pair walking toward them, both of who were young men. One had molten lava painted onto his mask, while the other wore a plain white one. Everyone on the Southern Lookout side seemed to recognize both young men and even shot complicated gazes toward the latter. However, a hint of confusion could be seen amongst those of the Eastern Lookout. Well, almost all of them. There was one particular group that seemed to have found the prey they were looking for. Almost like ravenous dogs tied to a chain they couldn't wait to free themselves from, they stared toward Lionel with all the animosity they could muster. You know who he is? Pisces, who was used to being the only one of her group of 3 who thought about the overall situation, noticed this distinct change. Through gritted teeth, a young man who had red veins painted across his mask and went by the name Ruptured Artery, spoke. We were tied up in a tree and couldn't get down for 3 days because of him. We nearly starved to death. Pisces frowned upon hearing this information. He was alone? Yes. And he still subdued you all without killing you? Yes, or injuring you? At this point, Ruptured Artery stopped speaking. He was already enraged enough without having to deal with the odd gazes he and his group was now receiving. However, the others of the Eastern Lookout could only look toward Lionel with vigilance. Ruptured Artery wasn't the best among them, but he wasn't the worst either. If he participated in the Southern Lookout gathering, he would have been the 4th or 5th seed. On top of that, he had been alone, yet he had been tied up in a tree without the ability to resist. Even with all this being said, the reason they were so apprehensive was because Lionel was a complete unknown. They had never even heard of him until this very moment. Chapter 150. Lionel didn't react much to all of the eyes on him. He was much more interested in learning what was going on here. This place looked so beautiful, but judging by the fact they were all at least 100 meters away from the nearest riverbank, nothing was as simple as it seemed. Hello. Lionel spoke first. Though he didn't think the amiable smile he had on right now was helping very much considering the fact he was wearing a mask, he still used it out of force of habit. Those of the Southern Lookout responded to Lionel's greeting with awkward nods, while those of the Eastern Lookout didn't say much of anything. Most were only curiously observing Lionel. However, the young man in question walked by them all and approached the closest riverbank. Indomitable, wait. Surprisingly, it was Roaring Black Lion who called out. Hearing the voice, Lionel couldn't help but stop and look back. It's dangerous. There's a group of creatures hidden in the lake led by an exceptionally powerful leader. Some of us almost lost our lives. When he was saying these words, Roaring Black Lion sent glares toward the Eastern Lookout youths once again. They had reached this place long before they had, yet hadn't said a word. Obviously, he had more than just one grievance with this group of people. Lionel nodded. Got it. Just want to check something. Lionel turned back and continued to walk forward. Roaring Black Lion didn't try to stop him again, he had already done all he could. Plus, it wasn't like he could stop Lionel by force. It wasn't long before Lionel had made it to the side of the closest river. He tried to reach in with his internal sight, but he suddenly found that passing it through water was a lot different than air. In fact, his range was reduced by a factor of 10, barely stretching down a couple tens of meters. In truth, this should have been enough to make it to the bottom of most rivers. But the issue was that not only was this river much deeper than usual, but even if it wasn't, the fact was that there was still the rest of its length and width to deal with. Even if he could see to the bottom, he could still only look to the left and right a few tens of meters. It didn't take Lionel long to decide that it was a fruitless endeavor. Instead of continuing to do something useless, he flipped his palm, causing the corpse of a deer with particularly sharp antlers to appear in his hands. The others were stunned by this. Some even had eyes that gleamed with curiosity and greed, most of whom came from the Eastern Lookout. It wasn't that those of the Southern Lookout were better people, it was just that they knew enough about Lionel to not foolishly think of stealing his things. Spatial treasures were already innately high-grade treasures. They were all at least grade treasures. But this alone wasn't enough for them to turn their greedy eyes toward Lionel. The most important point was how large of a space Lionel's spatial treasure must have. What they didn't know was that this carcass wasn't taken from Lionel's spatial bracelet, but rather from his segmented cube. In recent days, Lionel was really lamenting not knowing more about the segmented cube earlier. It was actually able to house little Tolly just fine even while within his spatial ring. Had he known this earlier, he could have stored Aina inside it while he escaped that day instead of sending her off to some unknown world. But at this point, he could only sigh. It wasn't like he could go back in time. Lionel turned his attention back to the riverbank. Then, with strength that surpassed a normal human, he tossed the deer carcass toward it. The reaction was immediate. The calm surface churned. In one moment, there was not a life form in sight. But, in the next moment, the water suddenly fell as though a pit hole had appeared at its bottom. Then, a massive mountain of blue shot up. Beneath the towering wave of water, Lionel could faintly catch a glimpse of beautiful, reflective blue scales. Without hesitation, he pulled out his pistol, shooting a single normal shot. He thought that this would be all he needed to end things. But the result was far outside of his expectations. Ding! Lionel's shot didn't even leave a dent. It rebounded off, causing Lionel to look in shock as his shot landed on a nearby patch of grass, burrowing into the soil. After a moment, Lionel smirked. Well, good thing I picked that beast in particular. The massive scaled creature fell back into the waters, causing waves to flood over the sides toward Lionel. However, he didn't move, weathering the storm. What is he doing? This was a question many of the youths were asking each other. Why was he standing in such a dangerous place? It should be obvious that normal methods weren't enough now. Kuwawa. There it is. Lionel's gaze grew focused. This was exactly what he was looking for. Don't blame me. Lionel grinned to himself. I've lost count of the number of times I've gotten fish bones caught in my throat. Consider this a little payback. The rage of the massive beast shook the river. Lionel could imagine its pain. That deer he had fed it was no joke. Lionel had defeated it easily, but after testing the strength of its sharp antlers, the result shocked even him. One could imagine the damage it could do inside that creature's stomach. However, this wasn't all Lionel wanted. He was still biding his time, still waiting. By now, the other youths realized that Lionel had done something. As for whatever it was clear that it was very effective. There it is. The creature surged up once again, doing whatever it could think of to try and alleviate the pain it was suffering. At that moment, Lionel did the unthinkable and jumped into the air with it. Chapter 151. Lionel surged toward the towering beast. With his improvement to his treasure shoes, even without activating its formation, his leaping ability was now beyond the realms of reason. Even jumping 20 to 30 meters into the air was no longer impossible. In a flash, he had already appeared above the creature, his palms flipping over to reveal two pistols. Wow, despite the fact his goal was to kill this creature, Lionel couldn't help but hesitate in the last moment. It was simply too much of a work of art. Before the metamorphosis, seeing such a beautiful creature was too difficult. Or, even if they did exist, they were on a much smaller scale than this. He could immediately tell that this creature was some kind of mutated koi fish. Its scales were various shades of blue, varying from what was almost a deep black to a sky blue. Its fins shot through the air almost like a pair of wings, and its tail fin, especially, flowed almost like the hair of a gorgeous woman. If there were any hardcore environmentalists here, there was no doubt they'd rip him apart for even daring to have thoughts on such a creature. But, at this point, the die had been cast. If he didn't shoot not, he would be the one in danger. Sorry, big guy. Lionel fired a series of shots, unrestrainingly concentrating his shot on the eyes of blue koi fish. Kuwawa. The bullets of white left spiraling trails of spinning wind in their wake, tearing a path through the raining water that shed reflective droplets in every which direction. The damage was undeniable. A spray of violet blood leaked from the blue koi's eyes as its body tried to flop back down to the river. But, would Lionel allow this? A layer of green enveloped Lionel's right sole. He launched himself forward, sending a strong kick toward the massive fish that knocked it toward the land. Without pausing, the sole of his other shoe lit, stopping his rebounding force and sending him back toward the shore. Lionel thought it would all be over at this point. A fish out of water, no matter how large it was just a fish out of water. It was self-explanatory. In fact, it was even more exaggerated considering how injured it was now. But, Lionel had forgotten to consider one important thing. Just what was this koi fish's ability? Just when the blue-scaled koi fish was about to land on solid ground, a shocking change took place. It took a dive as though it was going into water. At first, Lionel thought that this was simply because it was blinded. Maybe it was in so much pain that it hadn't even registered the fact Lionel had just kicked it. But in the next moment, Lionel was left speechless. The ground the koi fish should have landed against suddenly became as fluid as water. No. That wasn't it. It had actually become water. Lionel could only watch as what once was solid land suddenly became a lake. And then, as the fish rampaged, completely blind to its surroundings, it became a winding river. Suddenly, everything made sense. The odd structure of this island, the seemingly fantastical ways lakes and rivers appeared, the random and impossible to explain waterfalls. It was all the doing of this fish. Lionel's eyes widened, realizing that blinding this beast was maybe one of the worst things he could have done. Now it was blind, in pain and enraged. On top of having such an ability. Run! Lionel roared. From start to finish, the youths of both lookouts had been watching with shocked expressions. Lionel's actions seemed to get more and more wild with each passing moment. Lionel fell through the air. The process was completely out of his control. He had already used both platform jumps of his treasure shoes, and though he had improved them greatly, the cool-down time was still 30 seconds. Where there was dry land below him before, there was suddenly a vast and steadily growing lake. Well, maybe calling it a lake wasn't accurate because the erratic movements of the koi fish made it look like a toddler had randomly scribbled onto a page. However, Lionel wasn't worried. If it was before, he would fear a battle on the water. But, after he observed Old Hutch's use of force, he was able to glide on the surface of the lake. As far as he knew, there were no invalids on this island. Maybe they had already been weeded out by the beasts, or maybe they taken out by the overseers of Project Hunt. Even if this wasn't the case, the invalids who would appear here would all be beast types, so they wouldn't be interested in Lionel to begin with. So, he wasn't shy with using his force at all. Lionel landed heavily on the surging waves below, his body sinking into the point his hip were submerged before the buoyancy of his force sent him shooting back up. This is difficult. Lionel thought, his jaw clenched. He had used this ability to run from the boat that brought him here to the island. But, back then, the ocean had been fairly calm. He hadn't thought that it would be so much more difficult when the water was agitated. I need to end this quickly with a light elemental shot. Had Lionel not been too conservative in his approach before, he most definitely could have ended this earlier. But, it was impossible, even for him, to predict everything. Haha. Dealing with such a beast is what I'm built for. At that moment, the quiet and stoic King of Seas suddenly became a totally different person, charging forward in his brass speedo with trident in hand. Lionel frowned, but he didn't say much. If there were others with water abilities, it really could be useful. Those without them had already heeded his advice and retreated by a long measure. The only exceptions were those who were seemingly able to use force just like him. The Slayer Legion has force users. Lionel felt that maybe he had to reevaluate this group of rebels again. While his mind was half wandering, half focusing on the battle before them, their movements had caught the attention of the beast toward the center of the island. Their intelligent eyes flickered with a peculiar light. Chapter 152. Lionel's eyes madly scanned the body of water beneath him. Since his internal sight was so limited upon entering liquids, his best reliance was his eyes. Though it was true that this koi fish's ability was troublesome, there were some benefits to it as well. For example, the bodies of water it created were perfectly clear and without impurities, making it much easier to see through. The only thing that could disrupt Lionel's vision was the agitated water. But, wasn't this agitation perfect for telling exactly where that massive fish was? At that moment, King of Seas soared into the air, diving down. Lionel faintly caught the sight of his skin growing greenish-blue scales just before he entered the water. Lionel didn't stop him. With such an ability, King of Seas was indeed a good candidate for taking the vanguard. The trouble was that Lionel was certain this fish was far stronger than King of Seas judging by his stats. However, King of Seas had two advantages. Firstly, Lionel had already blinded the koi fish. And, Secondly, Lionel had yet to get a clean look at his stats after his transformation. It was possible that Lionel had underestimated him. Pisces shot a look toward Flowing Wind. But, after a brief communication with their eyes, the latter shook her head no. Pisces immediately understood. It seemed that Flowing Wind's scouting ability was useless in the water. After confirming this, she shot forward along the green grass while Flowing Wind rose into the air, stepping on the wind as though it was solid ground. As though not to be outdone, Chasing Wind soared into the air as well, followed quickly by thunderous clap. Roaring Black Lion hesitated for a moment, but chose to stay back. That said, it didn't mean he would do nothing. He quickly morphed into his humanoid beast form, filling his chest with air and billowing out with a roar that shook the surroundings. Lionel had been right. Roaring Black Lion's ability wasn't as simple as a transformation and a strength boost. He had a suppression ability he called King of Beasts. Though it worked on humans, it was especially effective on animals and had much more room to grow. In this sort of situation, even though he couldn't partake in the fight directly, his role was still invaluable. After his roar, the wild movements of the koi fish slowed considerably, allowing King of Seas to catch up and land a resounding strike with his trident to its side. A tornado of water blasted forward, sending the koi fish upward with an unquenchable momentum. Pisces reacted quickly. Droplets of water seemed to form around her like sparkling lights as her dress and hair fluttered. Though she could be looked down upon for actually wearing a dress to such an occasion, one could only admit that she looked amazing doing it. Flowing Wind and Chasing Wind reacted at that instant as well, causing the wind in the surroundings to kick up a storm that fused in the rising tornado of water. Kuwawa. The koi fish shot higher and higher into the air, unable to extricate itself. It was completely helpless. Haha. This kill will be mine, King of Seas. King of Seas controlled the water around him, forming a miniature tornado of his own to shoot into the skies after the koi fish. When he appeared, many couldn't help but be stunned. Greenish-blue scales covered him from head to toe. Odd fish-like membranes snapped closed and open over his eyelids. Fins jetted out the side of his face and webbing coated the distance between his fingers and toes. Anyway you looked at him, he was a fishman of legend. He grinned a savage, jagged grin, a sharp row of teeth shimmering beneath the sunlight as he soared into the air. Pulling his trident back, he mustered all his strength, using the water tornado beneath him to propel him forward and bring more power to his strike. He could almost see it. The sight of the fish being skewered. Whenever he activated his ability and entered this form, his blood would boil. As though he had a long lineage of ancestors who lived for battle and blood, an excitement that dug deep into his bones would take hold of him. Because of this, a young man who was usually quiet and stoic would now have these outbursts where he had to kill. His trident needed to taste blood or else he wouldn't rest. Who knew that in all his confidence, his trident would rebound off of the koi fish's scales as though he had smashed into a steel plate. His savage expression changed as a jarring pain assaulted his arm. The rebound force was so strong that he felt his shoulder almost dislocate completely. And, despite the fact it didn't, he could sense a few micro tears pulling at the muscles in his arms. The koi fish was sent flying toward the ground again, but this time, no one seemed happy about it. They all knew what would happen. The ground would turn into a body of water once again, and who knew if they'd be able to catch that fish again. But it was at that moment that a young man who had been doing nothing but scanning the lake's surface this whole time suddenly moved. It was too bad for this koi fish but 30 seconds had passed. The water beneath Lionel's feet bubbled as his force surged into his legs. Bang! The surface beneath his feet exploded as he launched himself into the air. Due to losing some of the momentum, he only managed to jump 10 meters, but to Lionel, he felt that this was more than enough. The moment he felt his momentum faltering, another green light blossomed beneath his soul. This time, he jumped over 20 meters, appearing above the flopping fish, 2 pistols in hand. He didn't hold back this time around. Both pistols were outfitted with a bullet that jetted out from the nozzle like an arrow. In fact, instead of calling it a bullet, it would be more appropriate to call these loaded pistols harpoons. If it was a regular shot, Lionel could shoot 20 to 30 times. If it was a light elemental force shot, Lionel could shoot 2 to 3 times. But, if it was this harpoon modified from his darts, he could only shoot once. There was a good reason for that. Bang! Kuwuwawa. The koi fish flopped to the ground with a resounding boom. But, this time, there was no new lake or river to speak of. Chapter 153. Lionel landed on the koi fish, exhaling a long breath. At the same time, a bit of fear couldn't help but creep into his heart as well as a bit of anticipation. This koi fish's ability was really too sinister. If he had been fighting alone, it could be said that he would have had a much harder time even if it ended in his victory. As for why he was filled with anticipation, it was of course because if he could refine the ability into a treasure, the potential applications were tantalizing. Lionel most wanted this ability for its application in escape. He could tell that the koi fish wasn't creating water, but was instead transforming earth into water. If this was a treasure instead of an ability and it was tweaked a bit, wouldn't it be possible to escape through the ground? There was another type treasure Lionel was thinking of making, but for now, he lacked the skill. Of course, he hadn't forgotten about Xinghai. If he could turn Xinghai's blink ability into a treasure, his combat prowess would take another leap. But, Lionel neither had the necessary materials, nor the skill to do anything with this idea. Any such treasure would be of, at the very least, the quasi-bronze grade. Obviously, this was beyond him. Lionel sighed, looking at the pistols in his hands. The nozzles had exploded from the inside out, leaving them useless. Unfortunately, now was definitely not the best time to repair them, so he could only continue from here with 8 nozzles remaining. After putting them away, Lionel made his way to the wound in the koi fish's eye and coated his arm in force. Reaching inside and relying on his internal sight, he was able to dig out the beast crystal with ease. The beast crystal looked like a smooth blue pearl, emitting a faint watery smell. The kind one would experience by a freshwater lakeside. "What do you think you're doing?" Lionel frowned, turning back to see King of Seas looking toward him with an unfriendly gaze. He had already dismissed his ability transformation, but judging by the red in his eye, he was still suffering from a bit of bloodlust. It was immediately obvious to Lionel that he was looking at the beast crystal in Lionel's hand. It was only now that Lionel remembered that to the other promising youths who had come with him, the beast crystals provided an opportunity to evolve their abilities. Even if Lionel discounted King of Seas, there was still Pisces as well. How could they not both want a beast crystal from such a powerful water-type creature? What Old Hutch had neglected to tell Lionel was that if one ingests a beast crystal from a creature with similar abilities, there's even the possibility of mutating and improving one's ability as well, making it even more desirable. This beast was at least of the SS grade in the eyes of these youths. Just how much would their abilities improve if they were to ingest it? King of Seas was especially looking forward to the potential defensive boost to his scales if he ingested it. Back then, his trident hadn't even left a scratch after his full-powered attack. As for Pisces, she was especially fond of the water transformation ability. As things stood now, she could only pull water vapor from the air when there were no other sources around. This was the source of all those beautiful sparkles floating around her when she attacked. If she was able to evolve her ability in this way, it could be said that she would instantly become one of the most powerful on Earth, let alone her generation. Regardless of who it was between them, it held lethal allure. "Hey, you ungrateful bastards from Eastern Lookout. Indomitable got the final kill, don't you think you're a bit too shameless asking what he's doing? Obviously he's taking his spoils." Roaring Black Lion didn't back down even a step. "Taking his spoils?" Pisces asked indifferently. It was all 7 of us who worked together to take down the fish, yet he didn't say a word before digging out the beast crystal himself. Even if he deserves the largest share, something that's still up for debate, he should at least discuss it with the rest of us, right? Those from the Southern Lookout frowned. What was up for debate? They all saw that King of Seas couldn't even scratch the beast's scales with his strongest strike. As for the rest of them, they only played a part in launching it into the air, something Lionel already proved would happen regardless as long as they were a bit more patient. It could be argued that Lionel could have taken the beast out without help at all. The only reason those of the Southern Lookout stepped in was because they didn't want to remain idle while the Eastern Lookout youths acted. Roaring Black Lion sneered. "Don't say I didn't warn you. He's not a person you can deal with just by ganging up like you did with me." Flowing Wind and Chasing Wind descended from the skies. Since Flowing Wind didn't need the beast crystal as the ability had nothing to do with water, she didn't join in. As far as she was concerned, this wasn't an Eastern versus Southern Lookout issue. This was purely a fight for benefits. There was nothing personal. She felt no need to put herself in any potential danger for the sakes of King of Seas or Pisces, even though they were teammates. Toward Roaring Black Lion's words, Pisces and King of Seas sneered. "Can't deal with just him?" King of Seas laughed, the red in his eyes brightening a bit more. If Lionel's guns hadn't broken right before their eyes, they might still fear him. But they all saw for themselves how they splintered and exploded. Of course, a weapon capable of killing an SS-grade threat was enough to make them fear, but wasn't this weapon destroyed now? Of course, these two simply had no idea that Roaring Black Lion wasn't referring to Lionel's treasures at all. How could they know? By now, they had already assigned the loss of that Eastern Lookout group led by Ruptured Artery to Lionel's guns. Now that they were out of the picture, there was nothing to fear. Lionel scanned King of Seas and Pisces, his gaze expressionless. Chapter 154. The Lionel of the past might have really been surprised by this turn of events. In the world he was used to, even if people held such greed in their hearts, they wouldn't display it so openly. But, after his run-in with Thunderous Clap, he had already come to accept it. This was his new world now. "I will be taking this beast crystal as it's useful to me. I'll also be taking a few of its scales and meat as well, but with a beast of this size, there's more than enough to go around for us all." Lionel said words he was planning on saying anyway before King of Seas spoke. If he really wanted to slight these people, he could easily take the entire beast into his segmented cube. With his strength and means, would any of them even be capable of stopping him from doing so? The fact he hadn't was already an act of kindness. In Lionel's mind, the most important thing to him now is getting back to Aina. In order to do so, he needed to have adequate strength. It was impossible to tell what might be going on terrain. When it came to matters related to Aina, he had no patience for nonsense, even if half that nonsense came from a beauty. A suffocating aura bloomed from Lionel's body. He had never been able to control this aura, but whenever his emotions became especially focused, it involuntarily leaked. Toward this change, it wasn't just King of Seas and Pisces that suddenly found it difficult to breathe. Even the youths from the Southern Lookout could only look toward Lionel with ghastly pale expressions. They had never sensed such a thing from Lionel, and how could they? That day, Lionel had been so tired. How could he possibly focus his emotions? Had he been able to focus on the task at hand like he usually did, they would have long since been drowned out by his aura. In that moment, the red in King of Seas' eyes completely retreated as though it had met something it feared. Lionel hadn't done a thing. He simply stood there and spoke. But, even if he told others that he wasn't purposely trying to suppress them, who would believe him? All the youths from the Southern Lookout only looked toward Lionel with more fear. Could it be that he had really held back that day? Or had he really been tired? That hadn't been a joke. After realizing what was happening, a flash of embarrassment and anger appeared on King of Seas' face. However, but he could do anything about it. What happened next left him stunned. The very guns he thought were already broken were taken out by Lionel once again. They could only watch as he calmly twisted the broken nozzles off and replaced them with new ones as though nothing had ever happened. King of Seas and Pisces couldn't help but gulp. This was already Lionel's final warning to them. If they really insisted on continuing, then he wouldn't mind teaching them a lesson. The last group that tried ended up in a tree for a few days. Lionel had no problem doing that again. Though there was now hesitation in the eyes of the two water ability users, Lionel could see that their resolve was slowly growing firmer. This sort of opportunity, it came once in a lifetime. Most of the water ability beasts could only be found in the ocean, but who dared to venture into it? The waters were simply too dangerous, and who knew what beasts evolved down there out of their control? In addition, just being an aquatic beast didn't guarantee a water ability either, and even if it did, it was unlikely to be as good as the one in Lionel's hands right now. Even with all this being said, there was another, maybe even more important, reason they had to do this. This place was one where they would be the strongest. And they could tell that Lionel wasn't comfortable with battling inside of water. If they tried to take this battle elsewhere, their strength would be greatly diminished. There was no better place for them to battle than by all of this water. Krrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrr distance. Lionel's pupils shrunk. It's not just one beast. Bang! An explosion caused many of the youths present to feel their ears rupture and begin to bleed. At first, it was impossible to tell exactly where this explosion had come from and what had caused it. It was simply too loud. But, a moment later, a raging pillar of billowing white steam shot into the air in the distance. The pillar was so thick and vibrant that it could be seen from over 10 kilometers away with a clearness that made it feel as though it was right before them all. Force? Lionel's eyes widened. That pillar, he could feel it. It was a flood of force with a level of density he couldn't fathom. Is that the force crystal mine old Hutch was talking about? Is it supposed to explode like that? Worry began to bubble up in Lionel's heart. Before, he was freely using his force because he was certain that there weren't any invalids on this island. With his density of force, the invalids that could threaten him were too far away. Plus, they would all be creatures of another species, so they wouldn't bother with him either. But, this density of force was on another level. In addition, if it really came from the force crystal mine, that meant it didn't come from any one species and might very well attract creatures of all kind. If this island was suddenly surrounded by an infestation of aquatic invalids, what could they do? How the hell would they get out of this place? Lionel's blood ran cold. Chapter 155. Lionel was likely the first to realize the problem, but he most definitely wasn't the only one. In the recent battle, many of the youths had displayed some level of force manipulation, whether small or big. There was no doubt they knew exactly what the geyser in the distance was. This isn't good. Not only would this geyser cause the island to be quickly surrounded by aquatic creatures, but there wasn't any guarantee that these creatures wouldn't come inland as well. It was wishful thinking to hope that they wouldn't. Lionel had already learned that lesson once before. The only way is to quickly stop that thing. After making this decision, Lionel aimed his pistol at the fish corpse beneath his feet, powering it with lethal light elemental force, and firing. His sudden action caused many who had been paling under the stress of the sudden change of events to whip their heads toward him. However, by then, Lionel's purpose had already been accomplished. He had perfectly aimed his shot toward a vulnerable point between the scales of the koi fish, causing them to bend at that point. Then, he reached down and pulled up with all his might, ripping the scales free from the dead beast's body. He worked quickly. In what felt like the blink of an eye, he had already pulled off over 10 beautiful blue scales, each of which was over a foot in length and about half of that in width. When he had about 20 in his possession, Lionel stopped, having stored them all within his spatial ring. Then, he looked off into the distance. If you all want to survive this, I suggest we put aside petty disputes for now and head over there. If we don't stop it, we're finished. Lionel's calm voice had a magnetic appeal to the youths around him. They couldn't help but instinctively want to listen. Going over there? Are you insane? Of course. How could everyone be of one mind? Where there were those with one thought, there would always be those with the opposing. This was just the way of the world, the way things worked. The person who spoke was none other than Ruptured Artery. Despite his history with Lionel, he hadn't spoken out of spite. Instead, he spoke on instinct. How could that place not be dangerous? This koi fish was the very first SS-grade threat they had ever met, and they all very clearly realized that they couldn't do anything to it. If it wasn't for Lionel, they would have forever been unable to cross this region toward the center of the island. Knowing this, it was obvious to them that there was likely more than one such creature like this here. And this also explained the scarcity of beasts as well. If they linked all of these points together, there was most definitely a horde of dangerous beasts, maybe no less powerful than the fish beneath Lionel's feet ahead. After thinking to this point, how could they possibly dare to continue forward? The best choice was to wait for their overseeing commander to come back and retrieve them. I will only say a few more words to convince you. If they fall on deaf ears, I won't be responsible for what happens to you after this. 1. You're not the only ones in danger. Your commanders, waiting offshore for you all, are in even more danger than we are. There's nowhere to hide on the open ocean. Lionel had hardly begun when the youths turned several shades more pale. Having thoughts that their commanders were infallible would be utterly stupid. The metamorphosis just began. Even though higher-ranking officials could be said to have far greater combat experience than them as youths, the truth was that there wasn't a large power disparity between them and their commanders. There were very few exceptions to this. Geniuses like Old Hutch who could make progress even in a third-dimensional world, then explode with all their potential now were incredibly rare. Simply put, there were most definitely no such people amongst the commanders. Second, time is of the essence. Even if the commanders could deal with the initial wave, could they survive a second, a third, a fourth? If you want any hope of making it off this island, the quicker the geyser is dealt with, the better. And third, you really don't have much of a choice. Lionel looked into the distance with a solemn expression. The direction he was looking at was surprising. In fact, he was looking toward the complete opposite direction of the force geyser. The dense forest of trees began to rumble and quake. First, it was subtle. It was an ever so slight swaying of the grass or rustling of the leaves. Then, it felt as though the ground itself was trembling. Soon, even the thick trees themselves began to swing to and fro as though made of rubber. The promising youths looked toward their backs with an eerie cold permeating their hearts. They suddenly understood what Lionel meant. Though the number of beasts in the forest was less than they imagined there would be, there were still many there. It was enough for Lionel to have killed over 20 in just his first few moments on this island. Even if the number was lacking. If they were all to converge on this point, they really didn't have a choice but to continue forward. If they tried to fight against the tide of beasts, wouldn't they be swallowed whole before even realizing what happened? Having said what he needed to say, Lionel didn't hesitate to dash into the distance toward the geyser, thinking to himself that he most definitely needed a treasure capable of transportation soon. But unfortunately, that would require crafting something much larger than he ever had before. In force crafting, difficulty wasn't just decided by the overall grade of the treasure, but also the size of it. A craft that was extremely small or large was definitely much harder to craft even compared to a craft several levels higher in grade. However, now wasn't the time to think about such things. Lionel could only lament his bad luck. This was supposed to be an easy trial he could place first in with a minimum amount of effort. Why had it suddenly become a life or death situation? Something about all of this felt off. Things weren't so simple as they seemed. Chapter 156. Lionel crossed lake after lake and river after river. He knew that the youths were quickly following behind him, hoping to put some distance between them and the beast horde coming from the dense forests. The wild, thunderous roars and booming tremors seemed to be getting closer and closer. Lionel's internal sight remained vigilant, but his expression was only growing more and more solemn. He noticed that his senses were growing less sharp. It was almost as though something was interfering with his ability to see the whole picture clearly. It must be the increased density of force, or maybe it's the fact that force is so unrestrained and volatile. Lionel didn't have a perfect answer, but this was his best guess. However, he didn't get a chance to think of any more examples because his footsteps suddenly came to a grinding halt. His heels dug into the ground in an exaggerated manner. It was to the point he almost fell backward. Just now, he had reached the top of the largest hill in this stretch of land, only to find a sight that his heart plummet. Though this was an island with a relatively circular shape, there was just a single path toward the center of it. This was precisely why the actions of the blue koi fish had stalled the youths for so long. With it taking control of the single path forward, they had to either find a way to bypass it or kill it the very same way Lionel had. The reason that there was just this singular path was because entrances from all other angles were flooded with deep valleys that seemingly had no entry points. Together, they became deep pits with unfathomable depths. Flowing wind and chasing wind had already considered the idea of simply flying over these valleys. But, for whatever reason, that still ended in failure. As for exactly why, maybe only those two women knew. At this moment, those valleys became those eerie death pits once more, trapping them. The trouble was that they weren't trapping them outside, but rather, inside this time around. However, just this alone didn't warrant this reaction from Lionel. He had already known about the deep valleys that blocked the path to the center of the island. After all, he had been here for half a month. How could he not think of venturing further in to find more targets? The trouble was that his path had been blocked. He wasn't omnipotent, nor had he reached the point of being able to cover the island completely with his internal sight. As such, just like the other youths, he had to slowly explore the island, trying to find another entrance in. It was then that he was lucky enough to run into erupting volcano and was able to learn that it was precisely because this one entry point faced the location the Eastern Lookout youths entered the island that they were able to find it first, followed by those of the Southern Lookout. So, why was all this important? Why was it that Lionel was frozen in place, even to the point of becoming an anchor that stopped the youths from moving forward any longer? It was because the moment he reached the top of the hill, he saw an army. One shouldn't mistake these words to mean that a group of humans were below. No. Each and every one of those soldiers in Lionel's line of sight were beasts. They were separated by their species. One group of a few dozen was led by a large bear that stood at over 5 meters tall with brownish gold fur. Another was led by a tiger no smaller than the bear, except its stripes were a bright red gold instead of the normal black. Yet another was led by a snake over 10 meters long, covered in black scales. As if these 3 weren't imposing enough, there was still another 3. There was a spider with vicious steel incisors and countless beady red eyes. Its size was the smallest at just 3 meters in length, but such a thing hardly stopped its grotesque visage from displaying its full might. The next was a lemur, a monkey-like creature with a zebra-striped tail. It was far larger than it should have been, standing no shorter than the red-gold-striped tiger. However, the last was maybe the most shocking of all. It didn't seem to be a beast at all. Or rather, it was, but had been stripped of all its flesh. It stood on all fours, not much unlike an ape would. From head to toe, it was nothing but bone. Its body was covered in a faint transparent light that seemed to reflect the vision of an armor, but it would often flicker and disappear as though lacking the ability to maintain its own form. These 6 creatures were easily the most powerful. However, what truly shocked Lionel were the orderly soldiers to their backs. Each of them had a troop of their own, neatly arranged as though they truly were an army of humans rather than beasts. Each took control of their own species, wielding absolute authority. The golden brown bear had a troop of bears. The red gold-striped tiger had a legion of tigers. The black-scaled snake's troop filled the air with endless hissing. Each had their own centers of power. Even the bone ape had a legion of apes, though their flesh and blood was intact. Lionel quickly tried to calm his breathing. However, any hopes he had of not being noticed had already long since been thrown out the window. The instant he had made it to the top of the hill, he found 6 pairs of eyes trained on him. The bestial, murderous intent made it feel as though a bucket of ice water had fallen onto his head. His heartbeat involuntarily slowed. At that moment, the brownish gold bear roared and turned its head toward the spider legion. To Lionel's dismay, the spider's numerous beady red eyes landed on him once again, its mandibles snapping together in what looked like a response. Chapter 157. The youths who charged forward with Lionel paled. Their legs grew weak to the point some of them all but collapsed. There was even a good portion of them that wanted to turn and run this very moment. But, when they thought about the horde of beasts to their back, they realized that there really was no place to go. Were they really finished? Just like this? Some of them were here for a chance to enter an SS grade zone. Now that they thought about it, just how foolish were they? A single SS grade threat like the koi fish had stumped them for so many days already until Lionel came. Wasn't it too much of a joke to be striving for such a quota? The more they thought like this, the more they disparaged themselves, and the greater their fear grew. In the distance, the horde of spiders was swiftly moving forward, their 8 limbs shimmering beneath the sunlight and slicing through the wind. They could only imagine what it would feel like being pierced by one of those things. How horrible would their deaths be? Though these youths were part of the Slayer Legion, their childhoods weren't much different from Lionel's. Fights between the Empire and the rebels were much rarer in those days compared to after the metamorphosis. It could only be said that they were marginally more prepared than other youths since they received military training. But now, they froze up. Facing a beast one-on-one was one thing, but suddenly facing over 100 charging forward like this made them feel as though their lives were already finished. This would really be their last day on this earth. Hey! Lionel suddenly roared, shocking them out of their thoughts. His voice was so loud that it traveled over a mile, even overshadowing the rushing sound of force surging out from the geyser up ahead. If you don't want to die, pull yourselves together. You see over there, there's a network of caves. Our goal is to cut through here and make it there. Then we might stand a chance. I'll take the vanguard, don't lose sight of my back. They all saw what Lionel was pointing toward. After the rolling hills of green the blue koi fish had called home, the land suddenly became bleak and desolate, filled with grayish-black gravel-like land. This bleak land was connected to the valley system that blocked their entrance from other regions. Without any context, it looked no different from a land of death. Nearer toward the center of this land of death, there was another hill. Though this hill wasn't as tall, it was very wide. It was made completely of dull grayish-black stone and had numerous holes of varying sizes dotted across its surface. In truth, it was more accurately described as a hive rather than a hill. The geyser of force, still jetting out into the skies, came out from this very hive, out of a hole at the very center of it all. Lionel could also tell that the origin of this geyser was incredibly deep underground. Thinking of the deep valley system, Lionel couldn't help but think that they were connected in some way. But, even though he intuitively felt this, he didn't have the time to put his brain power toward trying to figure it out. The Spider Legion was already closing in. In the beginning, they were over half a kilometer away, but now, they were already less than half of that. We have the high ground right now, but trying to maintain this position is stupid. Those beasts seem to have intelligence, so if they see that the Spider Legion is losing, they won't just sit idly by. The good news is that they only sent one of the 6 groups after us, leaving a gap in their defenses we can take advantage of. The bad news is that we still need to make it through the Spider Legion and those other 5 legions if we want to seek refuge in that hive. Lionel gritted his teeth. He knew they needed to charge, there was no other way. The truth was that turning back to pierce through the horde of beasts toward their backs would be easier. They had far less organization and would definitely be weaker than this threat up ahead. But, if they did that, then what? There were definitely even more beasts headed here from the ocean, having sensed the surge of force. If they couldn't deal with this problem in front of them, they would be finished. Lionel flipped his palm, a familiar spear appearing in his hand. Compared to the last time when its spearhead had been split by Hutch's blade, it had already been repaired. How could he come here without first comprehending spear force? After Lionel did this, the dictionary unlocked a lot of information about the spear domain ring for him. There were many useful things, but what was most important to him now was the fact that spears acknowledged by the ring can be repaired. Unfortunately, he had left the primitive man's spear outside for too long, causing its consciousness to dissipate. As a result, the ring no longer acknowledged it and was unable to repair it. But, this primitive woman's spear was different. Not as much time had passed, and since it was just a low-level spear of the spear domain, it didn't even take an hour to repair fully. Lionel's aura completely changed, becoming even sharper and more violent than before. Seeing this, the youths inexplicably felt a sense of calm. Before, when the aura was aimed toward them, they found it difficult to even breathe. But now, having experienced the aura of protection Lionel's teammates had for so many years already, they suddenly felt their strength surging. Lionel took out the dictionary and slipped it into his pocket. With the situation like this, he couldn't afford to keep it hidden any longer. What's the weakness of that Spider King? Lionel's sudden words caught the youths who had just regained their bearing off guard once again. But they were even more shocked when there was an actual response. Ping replying to Seed, the seam between the head and body is a vital point. Lionel didn't even turn back after hearing this. Follow me, I'll carve out a path. He could feel his blood boiling. He understood that this was his true state. The state his lineage factor was meant to be in. Chapter 158. Hong. Lionel took a strong step forward. Lionel Morales, Force Amplified, Strength, 2, 59, Speed, 2, 38, Agility, 2, 43, Coordination, 2, 61, Stamina, 2, 73, plus 0, 05, Nullified, Reactions, 2, 63, Spirit, 2, 92, Force, 0, 60. The grass beneath his feet swayed wildly, being pressed down by his momentum as he took yet another step forward. Hong. Lionel Morales, Force and Spear Domain Lineage Factor Amplified, Strength, 2, 85, Speed, 2, 62, Agility, 2, 67, Coordination, 2, 87, Stamina, 2, 73, plus 0, 05, Nullified, Reactions, 2, 90, Spirit, 2, 92, Force, 0, 66. With Lionel as the center, billowing winds spread out, leaving a trail of concentric circles as though a helicopter was descending from above. At that moment, Lionel smiled lightly. I haven't gotten back to Aina yet. I have no intention of dying in this place. I'm sure you all heard that. Lionel said without turning back. Aim well. Lionel dashed forward, his speed so swift that it almost looked like his feet weren't touching the ground. To his back, the youths clenched their jaws. By now, in the chaos of the moment, those of the eastern and southern lookouts didn't have the luxury of continuing to remain separated. King of Seas and Pisces were still fuming over what happened earlier, but did they have much of a choice? If they didn't band together now, wouldn't their slim chance at survival become even slimmer than it already was? Still, despite the situation, those of the southern lookout had complicated feelings of their own. They couldn't help but feel awed about Lionel's actions to this point. Wasn't he supposed to be arrogant and insufferable? Someone with those kinds of personality traits would probably use their superior power to force them to act as meat shields. If it came down to it, and Lionel forced them to take the vanguard, would they even be able to say no? Where would they go? Without a pillar of support like Lionel, what were their odds of survival? Lionel crossed the last line of grass and stepped onto the gravel-like land of death. To him, it simply didn't matter whether those to his back followed him or not. He was a person with a soft heart. This was precisely why he had taken on the role of their vanguard. However, it was impossible for him to put himself in any more danger should they choose to hesitate. The loose land beneath his feet was kicked up into the air as his hair whipped about wildly. There was something freeing knowing that all of his opponents were just beasts, as though an inhibition on his heart had been removed and he could finally let loose. At that moment, a familiar roar sounded behind Lionel, causing his lip to curl into a more prominent smile. It seemed that they had finally decided to follow. Call of the Wind, the ease with which Lionel used this technique simply couldn't be compared to the first time he had done so. It looked as though he had only casually flicked his wrist a few times, yet several lines of white curled in the air, finding the gap between the head and thorax of several spiders in the blink of an eye. Lionel could at most use this technique a few times in the past. But now, using it over 100 wasn't an issue. Before he had even met the front line of the charging legion, almost a dozen large spiders had already fallen, their mandibles chopping at empty air. As expected, the smaller ones have the same weakness as the larger one. How could all of these spiders be of the same subspecies? Things would never be so convenient. Let alone this spider legion, even the legion of the tiger and bear weren't completely homogeneous. But, what stood true was that like converged with like. The spider legion was mostly made up of various mutated arachnids and different kinds of insects. The tiger legion was most constructed of large cat-like beast. So on and so forth. Now that Lionel had a firm grasp of their weakness, he wouldn't allow them to stop his path forward. Especially not now that he had support coming to his back. In another few strides, Lionel had met the spider legion. The youths charging closely to his back couldn't help but be shocked by his dauntlessness. But, if they knew that Lionel's first trial in this world was facing an army of Spaniards with no weapon outside of a bicycle, they would think much differently. This fearlessness, this dauntlessness, the firmness of his stride and the straightness of his back, he had earned them all with his blood, sweat and tears. Lionel's movements became ethereal, his steps carrying a bit of the elegance of the primitive woman. As devastating as Call of the Wind was in the long range, in the short range, it was even more so. Lionel carved a path, sliding past the sharp legs and chomping pincers of insects and spiders around him. If all he had to do was make it past, he would have long since stepped through the air. However, he held his ground firmly, every pierce of his spear reaping another life. Suddenly Lionel took his left hand off the staff of his spear, flipping his palm to reveal his pistol. His hips spun as he fired a single shot. In the distance, Precious' moment had fallen. She scrambled to pull back, ignoring the hard gravel scraping across her palms and bottom as she hurried back. The mandibles of a mantis-like creature snapped toward her, not caring for the tears and snot running down her face. Emilia! Seer roared from a battle to her side, but he knew he wouldn't make it in time. Disregarding himself, he pointed his staff toward the mantis, blowing it away. But, before he could sigh in relief, he realized the spider he had been fighting was now free to attack him. A leg glistening like steel shot toward his chest. He could almost see the scene of his chest being pierced right through. However, he could have never expected a single shot to find its mark at that very moment. The spider had hardly raised its legs before it fell limply to the ground, unable to get up again. Seer looked toward the direction of the shot, only to find Lionel's back looking back at him. A feeling of gratefulness welled up in his chest. He fired that shot even before I saved Emilia. Just how did he predict what would happen? Unfortunately, this wasn't the time for him to ask this question, because his savior was facing his own problems now. After seeing Lionel take out so much of its own, the Spider King, which had been taking a back seat, suddenly couldn't any longer. Lionel's jaw steeled. Give me a rundown of this spider's abilities. Chapter 159. Ping evolved life form detected. Kingdom, Animalia, Phylum, Arthropoda, Class, Arachnida, Order, Araneae, Infraorder, Mygalomorphae, Family, Theraphosidae, State, Evolved, Abilities, Ping generating nomenclature. Venomous touch, Tier 8 black grade venom detected. This venom has been infused with every fiber of this creature's being. Rebounding web, spider silk with astonishing elasticity. Sturdy web, spider silk Tier 7 black grade toughness. Weakness, between head and abdomen, evaluating power, Ping, evolution stage, elite Tier 7 black, Lionel's brow furrowed. He had been very worried about the webs of these spiders when he charged, but he didn't expect that the matter would be even more troublesome than he originally thought. To make matters worse, this still wasn't considered an SS grade threat? Tier 7 black, that translated to S grade. But, what was with the elite tag, what did that mean? Now that he thought about it, Lionel remembered that the octopus was classified as peak Tier 7 black. So there were separations like this? No matter how curious he was, Lionel knew that this wasn't a time to ask this question. All he needed to guess was that this spider was a greater threat than the octopus. Knowing this, he had to ask questions that could help him keep his life. Can my chain necklace block the toxicity? Ping replying to Seed, the energy shield can block about 80% of the venom's toxicity. Lionel's frown deepened, but his footsteps didn't stop. He dashed toward the spider, but when it seemed they would clash, he suddenly changed directions, headed off to the side with all the might he could muster. He knew that the spider would chase after him because all along the way, his spear had never stopped. He continued carving a path forward, outpacing the spider by a measure. Lionel could tell by the spider's stats that its speed was actually much higher than his own. However, its agility was very low. Making it navigate a battlefield like this, especially when it had to be careful not to poison its own legion, was about the best thing Lionel could do at this moment. Is there no other way to deal with the spider's venom? Lionel knew he needed to be incredibly specific when asking questions to the dictionary. It wouldn't simply offer him up answers based on the situation. So, Lionel had slowly learned to keep an open mind and ask things he might not usually ask. In his mind, he didn't have anything else that could deal with venom. But who knows if this was really true? Outside of his expectations, it seemed he was correct to ask. Ping light elemental force has a strong healing effect and is the bane of many toxins. Seed's light elemental force is still too low to be considered immune. Lionel's eyes widened. Too low. There are levels to light elemental force? Lionel really didn't expect this. He thought that a force-strengthening deviation was as advertised. He didn't expect for there to be more. Ping yes. Even in the midst of the battlefield, Lionel couldn't help but curse under his breath. Couldn't this damned dictionary be a bit more forgiving? Why did every answer need to be so short and to the point? It really never touched on anything he didn't directly ask it. Lionel couldn't help but wonder how many things he had missed out on because of this. Forget it, now isn't the time to ask this. That damn spider is hot on my heels. Lionel knew he couldn't put too much effort into running away from the spider. Though he felt he could escape on his own, he was meant to be acting as a vanguard currently. If he strayed too far, instead of opening up a path, he would be allowing the other youths to get swallowed up. The youths who had come to this hunt still number about 80 or so. With such a number, even though they were still vastly outnumbered, it was definitely better than going in alone. Lionel needed them as much as he didn't have the heart to leave them here to die. So, he could only hope that the combination of his light elemental force and his energy shield was enough to hold out. Lionel's spear flickered forward, leaving after images in the air as he pierced another spider through. Compared to the massive 3-meter-long spider to his back, the ones before him were barely half a meter long. But, were still far larger than what one would expect. The gross creatures sent a chill up even Lionel's spine, but he still pushed them down his spear like a kebab before turning back and whipping them toward the quickly approaching spider. The spider leader's leg lashed out, slicing the soaring corpses in half with a single strike and causing a rain of green guts to fall from the sky. In that moment, its vision was obscured, allowing Lionel to rapidly close the distance. Lionel ducked down and slid across the gray gravel, trying to get beneath the spider's body to attack its weak point. But, just as he was going to succeed, the spider leader seemed to realize that something was off. Its mouth opened, its mandible-like protrusions snapping as a violet fog fell from its mouth. Lionel quickly held his breath, explosively retreating. Damned dictionary. It said venomous touch, it never said anything about venomous fog. At that moment, a white strand of silk shot out like a bullet. No, it wasn't completely white. Beneath the sunlight, it reflected a slight hint of fluorescent purple. It was so subtle that even with his senses, Lionel almost didn't catch it. Lionel immediately recognized that this was the spider's true ability. He had wrongly accused the dictionary this time. Venomous touch was described as a venom infused into every fiber of the spider's being. That would include its breath. Damn, Lionel rolled out of the way in a sorry state, just barely managing to dodge the bullet of silk. But, the insect beast behind him's cry of pain made it obvious that it wasn't so lucky. Lionel turned back to find it quickly turning purple, then black, then erupting into a cluster of dark fog and ash. If he didn't know better, he would think that it had been burned in a furnace, it was now that Lionel suddenly realized that maybe the other 5 legions of beasts hadn't made a mistake just sending the Spider King here. Chapter 160. Lionel's expression grew dignified. He was reluctant to use his light elemental force. It wasn't because he was trying to hide it, but because the consumption was too great. Not only did it drain his spirit, but it also drained his force at a much faster rate. Though his spear force also had the same impact on him, it wasn't nearly as exaggerated. But this also made sense since his spear force wasn't as powerful either. But, at this point, what choice did he have? Hong. The dull color of Lionel's eyes suddenly lit brightly, a blinding glow shooting out from within their depths. Come on, you damned bug. Lionel flashed forward, leaving a streak of gold in his wake. He looked like a shooting star streaking across the battlefield, catching the eye of several of the youths battling for their lives. Their blood couldn't help but boil watching Lionel face up against this Spider King on his own. Was this his ability? They all seemed to have this thought. Lionel crossed into the foggy venom domain of the Spider King, sending several piercing strikes forward at once. The Spider King's response wasn't slow. Its sharp steel-like legs deflected the first few as its mandibles chopped at Lionel. When it saw Lionel retreat out of the way, another streak of silk shot from its mouth, heading directly for him. Shockingly, Lionel didn't dodge this time, facing the strike head-on as a pistol appeared in his hand, already loaded with a dart. Bang! Ugh, Lionel was sent flying. It felt as though the Spider King's projectile was a javelin crashing into his chest. His face turned red and bulged, only for a projectile of blood to fly from his mouth. The enraged and pain-filled roars of the spider caught the attention of the other legions of beasts, but they all hesitated to come forward. There was a reason they were still standing outside the large hill-like hive. They were waiting for the right opportunity to charge in and gain benefits for themselves. If they really left now, who knows what could happen. These beasts were obviously not stupid. Since this place had such a large pull toward them, it obviously had a massive pull toward others. This was why they were standing in this position. But, despite having evolved, their thoughts were still relatively simple and straightforward. It was difficult for them to respond with great flexibility. Before they could even make a decision, the situation changed again. The rumbling of beasts that came from out of the forest suddenly sounded much closer. They could only look over to find hundreds of wild beasts charging over the hills, barreling through and crossing into the gravel-filled lands. Compared to the beast legions with their respective kings, it was clear that these beasts had much less intelligence. Their tongues hung out from their mouths, a red tint coloring their eyes as though they had lost their minds. They wanted nothing more than to find the source of all this rich force. Another sharp crack rang out in Lionel's ears as he slid across the ground. He was very much familiar with this sound. He knew that his chain necklace had suffered another break. Sweeping his internal sight over it, his expression somewhat paled. The first break had caused its efficacy to drop by 10%. This time around, the treasure only had 70% of its initial strength left. Lionel didn't even have a mind to care about his current situation. This treasure had saved his life too many times already. If it really broke completely, it would be too great of a loss to swallow. He grit his teeth, glaring toward the screaming spider who seemed to not even have a mind to organize its own troops. I should have pierced its brain with that strike, but maybe I was too optimistic. I don't know anything about the anatomy of a spider, or maybe it didn't pierce that deeply. Lionel shook his head hard. Run! He snapped the youths who were too focused on battle out of it. They needed to take advantage of his beast tide to apply pressure on the other beast legions. If they were to get caught up in it, their last chance would go up in a puff of smoke. Lionel grit his teeth, ignoring the pain racking his body to stand. He sent a glance across the battlefield, sighing a faint breath of relief when he saw that everyone had managed to barely keep some forward momentum and, most importantly, stay together. Under Lionel's lead, they bolted toward the legion of beasts, their trail being followed by a tide of wild beasts. The Spider Legion didn't seem to know how to react with their leader screaming out and writhing in pain. They were soon swallowed by the beast tide. Lionel's heart almost beat out his chest with his every stride, once again swearing to himself that he would most definitely get some sort of transportation treasure. As he ran, Lionel looked down at his chest with a solemn expression. A web spread out, covering half his chest and his shoulder. With every passing moment, it ate into his energy shield, causing the cracks across it to grow. Damn it, without a choice, Lionel took off his tight, black compression shirt before it could continue to corrode the energy shield. He coughed violently, unable to mind the state of his body as he ran. He really couldn't believe it. He thought that by now, facing even an SSS-grade threat wouldn't put him in too sorry of a position. But now he had suddenly found out that there were still S-grade threats that could push him to this state. At a time like this, he couldn't help but lament that his ability was auxiliary and not attack-based. Lionel shook his head as the distance between him and the 5 legions closed. He once again heard roaring black lions' roar sound out from his back. He didn't need to look back to know the beast tide had slowed somewhat because he could clearly see that even that beasts up ahead were greatly affected. Lionel didn't have the mind to care about anything else. All of his being was focused on charging through the gap left by the Spider Legion. He wouldn't let anything stop him. His oppressive aura involuntarily shot out from his body, covering the lands before him in a layer of oppression. Chapter 161. Lionel controlled his speed. He was more than capable of leaving the trailing youths to his back far behind, but would doing this benefit him? If anything, it would put him in danger. Not only did he need to maintain their pace such that they were ahead of the beast tide, he needed to ensure they could also remain together. With him in the lead, he perfectly took into account the speed and stamina stats of everyone. By now, any youth worthy of being part of this group had a complete set of stats above 100. This was more than enough to cross the remaining 400 or so meters in just half a minute. They had already crossed half the distance before the legion of beasts couldn't sit idly any longer. Lionel didn't know why it was that they were still waiting, but what he was certain of was that they didn't want anyone entering before they did. The brownish gold bear stepped forward, roaring as though giving a warning. The beast tide behind the group of youths faltered for a moment, but it seemed that they had completely lost all reasoning. It was clear that this fact completely enraged the brownish gold bear. He raised up onto his hind legs, billowing into the skies before slamming his front paws down. The earth suddenly became turbulent. It seemed for a moment that nothing would happen, but then an earthen tide suddenly rose into the skies, causing Lionel's expression to change violently. Earth control? This bear needs to die. The moment Lionel made the decision, he didn't hesitate. The only chance for him and the youths with him to survive was to enter the hive network, making use of the network of tunnels to both hide and find a path toward the source of the force geyser. However, if there was an earth-controlling beast that entered into a network of tunnels with them, they wouldn't even know how they died. If others heard Lionel's thoughts, they would think he was crazy. Though his line of thinking was correct, how could he possibly spare time for such a thing? Anyone else would focus on surviving this situation first, then worry about what came later. However, Lionel had been a star quarterback. Every move he made on the football field considered what might happen 5, 10, even 20 plays later. Sometimes, it wasn't worth taking a victory if it guaranteed a loss later. Likewise, it was sometimes worth it to eat a loss for the sake of ultimately grasping victory. Looking at the compression shirt in his hand, Lionel's eyes flashed. "Do your best to dodge," Lionel roared. There was a limit to his abilities. While he could put himself on the line to deal with this beast, he couldn't also help them all dodge this attack. But, he wasn't worried. These were all promising youths for a reason. Without hesitation, Lionel's speed suddenly doubled, then doubled again. He looked like a streak of light tearing across the graveled land, leaving a trail of dust in his wake. He leapt over the 3-meter wall of earth with absolute ease. By now, his distance from the Bear King had already shrunk to 50 meters. At this point, he could even see the reflections in its large black eyes. He could sense its fury, its rage, its killing intent. But his heart remained steady. 40 meters. 30 meters. 20 meters. Roar. Seemingly worried about the coming beast tide, the Bear King didn't force his legion to charge toward Lionel. Plus, in its mind, how could he possibly not be able to deal with a single human by itself? The size difference was striking. The bear stood at over 5 meters tall, yet Lionel was barely 2. Even the former's palms seemed capable of swatting him into a meat patty, but Lionel dauntlessly approached. At that moment, the Bear King seemed to sense Lionel's oppressive aura. Its rage had muddled its senses for a moment, but once Lionel came so close, it felt to him that hell had suddenly descended. The bear was shocked for a moment, only to find that Lionel had suddenly appeared in the air above it, pointing a black shirt at it. Confusion colored the bear's features. Why was this human pointing a piece of cloth at it? The Bear King's intelligence was just starting to develop, but the scene before it was completely baffling. It couldn't combine the threatening aura it felt from the human with the scene before it. For the first time, a beast would pay a price for its rising intelligence. If it was still a normal bear, it wouldn't have hesitated to turn and run. It didn't have emotions like pride, it only had instincts of survival. But, by now, it had grown the fondness for kingship. It had become intoxicated with power. It had already sent the spider forward before, causing it to suffer a major setback. If it didn't step up now, the other beast kings would be dissatisfied. This was his role to take on. Bang! The moment it opened its mouth to roar its fear away, a searing pain ripped through its tongue and throat. At first, it was the pain of having its flesh torn and pierced. But, in what felt like an instant, its vision grew blurry. It happened so quickly that the human that had been standing in the air above it didn't even have time to land on the ground before its inner organs were completely corroded. Lionel sucked in a cold breath as the bear collapsed. He had known that the Spider King's poison would be potent, but he most definitely didn't expect it to be so exaggerated. He couldn't help but feel a cold shiver run down his spine. If it wasn't for his chain necklace, he would be finished. After taking a look at the fourth nozzle he had completely ruined, Lionel sighed, landing on the ground heavily. With a dull bang, the Bear King fell to the ground. Chapter 162. The fall of the Bear King was almost like flipping a switch. The shocked beasts suddenly began to release howls of rage. The beasts under the Bear King's rule especially lost control, charging forward without regard for anything. But what shocked Lionel was the direction they charged. Instead of coming toward him like he had expected, they actually charged toward the force geyser, leaving Lionel speechless. He had thought that out of some sense of loyalty, these bear beasts would go all out and fight him to the death. But it seemed that he had greatly overestimated them. Or maybe he was just lacking in understanding. Ultimately, these were wild beasts. They hadn't evolved to the point their thoughts were as meticulous as humans. Only the S-grade elites among them were slightly better, but even then, that seemed to have as many downsides and upsides judging by the way the Bear King died. It was likely that even SSS-grade beasts couldn't match up to humans in intelligence. They might only be capable of doing so after entering the realms of the fifth dimension or higher. Either way, this was a good thing for Lionel. The path toward the hive now suddenly had 2 massive holes in it, and there was even a horde of bear creatures opening the path for him. Taking a look over his shoulder, he found that the youths had just about caught up during his battle. After a faint nod, he bolted forward, not having time to reprimand the segmented cube for sucking up the Bear King's corpse. What the hell could he do with that poisoned meat? He didn't even feel like the beast crystal would be safe to use any longer. But now wasn't the time to consider any of this. There was suddenly a new challenge before Lionel now. Despite the fact the hive was now practically right before them, what would they do after entering it? And what was the situation inside? Though their large number was an asset before, if the tunnels of the hive were narrow and cramped, this advantage would quickly become a disadvantage. Lionel felt a headache coming on, but he followed the charging bears in without hesitation. He could only ignore the roars coming from the remaining 4 legions of beasts. Unlike the beasts, Lionel didn't charge into the first tunnel he could. After reaching the range of the hive, he leapt up, quickly climbing the hill-like structure and dropping down a tunnel with a fairly shallow fall. Seeing Lionel's actions, the youths followed with little hesitation. His method was indeed the best. The beasts were straightforward, so they automatically entered the easiest holes of the hive, but who said they had to do so as well? Entering the darkness, Lionel suddenly felt a calmness still his heart. He almost felt right at home. How long had he spent in those dark Mayan tunnels, using nothing but his sharp senses to navigate his path ahead? He had an instinct to run forward as quickly as possible, but Lionel didn't do this. Instead, he turned around and held his ground, waiting for the youths who followed in after him. The tunnels were wide enough for about 4 robust males to walk shoulder to shoulder at once. Not too narrow, but also not too large. While this was a bit of a disadvantage with their numbers being about 80, it was a disadvantage the enemy had to contend with as well. Though Lionel's approach sent them away from the majority of beasts, he would be too naive if he thought that not a single one would follow them in. He could sense that the Spider King hadn't approached the hive for whatever reason, but this was good news. He wouldn't know how to deal with that Beast King's poison breath in such a small place. If it really came, he would have no choice but to run. At that moment, the first line of youths caught up with Lionel. "Run by me, I'll hold the line here and kill any beasts that follow us in," Lionel said quickly. Roaring Black Lion and the other top youths of the southern and eastern lookouts were the first to catch up, unsurprisingly. When they heard Lionel's words, they understood his intention and nodded. King of Seas and Pisces hesitated for a moment, but they still followed suit. If they really stirred up problems right now, they probably wouldn't just be the enemy of the southern lookout youths. At that point, maybe even their own people would turn against them. Their gazes flickered as they retreated and Lionel pretended not to notice. Bear King died? At that moment, a familiar youth's eyes opened wide. He stood frozen on the spot, unable to understand. Compared to his reaction when Wurat 006 died, this was far more dignified. He knew exactly how powerful this creature of his was, yet it had died. Could it be that other powerful beasts had appeared? That was impossible. He had scouted the entire island and taken all the SS-grade threats under his control. Unless those beasts from the ocean really got here so quickly? Young lord, is something the matter? At that moment, the others looked toward the youth, realizing his weird expression. They all understood that something outside of their expectations must have happened. The group that had been traveling down a particularly dark tunnel couldn't help but pause their steps. The young man stood silent for a long while, not responding to the questions his subordinates had for him. He was trying to decide whether or not he should call in the other Beast Kings to deal with this potential threat, but in the end, he shook his head. Since only Bear King died, it likely meant that the Beast Kings had come together to deal with the situation. If he called them in now, it might very well be allowing that creature a chance to enter where it might not otherwise be able to. Lionel had always assumed that the beasts were waiting outside the hive for a specific moment. Maybe the force geyser was dangerous, or maybe the mine it originated from wasn't perfectly ripe yet. Aside from this, he hadn't thought of another possibility. The possibility that the Beast Kings were guarding the entrance at the request of their master. The youth looked up from his thoughts. "Let's go, we need to explore these tunnels and find the path toward the force crystal mine faster." The guards around the youth looked toward his multi-lens monocle and didn't dare to disobey. Chapter 163. Lionel sat at a corner of the cave, breathing heavily. Compared to a few hours ago, he was in a far sorrier state. At least, he looked to be. Though his clothes were fairly clean due to the abilities of his chain necklace, the rest of him was dead tired. His visage was pale, his fingers twitched every so often due to the exhaustion of his muscles, and his breathing was haggard. Within the cave that branched from the tunnels of the hive, the other youths were present as well. Some of them sent worshipping gazes toward Lionel while others had more complicated looks. Among them, King of Seas and Pisces were especially left feeling complex. They knew now how powerful Lionel was, but it only left them feeling even more helpless. After a long while, Lionel's breathing finally calmed. He really wanted to go to bed at this point. His sleep in recent weeks hadn't been great due to that dark elemental beast. However, he obviously couldn't do so now. This was no different than the calm before the storm. They had dealt with their initial safety, but if they still cared about their long-term safety, they had to find a way to deal with the geyser. Though the cave they were in now seemed calm, this wasn't the case at all. The wind in here was especially volatile. It wasn't enough to hurt any of them, but the fact there was strong wind in a cave located so deep underground was already enough to raise an eyebrow. In addition, Lionel really didn't know if there were any other dangers associated with the force geyser, so sleeping in such a place was definitely not an option, at least not until he handled some things. Taking a deep breath to finally calm his heart, Lionel took out the silver disc dictionary. How dangerous is this force geyser? Due to the overall silent atmosphere, Lionel's sudden voice definitely drew a lot of attention, especially since many had been sparing him glances to begin with. At first they thought he was talking to himself, but then they suddenly remembered that weird voice that replied to him before when he asked for the Spider King's weakness and couldn't help but listen intently. Ping, the term force geyser is unrecognized. Judging by Seed's meaning, force eruption is being referenced. Force flows from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. The human body is considered to be a semi-closed system. When approaching a force eruption, there is the potential of inducing a force node implosion which can result in the crippling or death of the person in question. Hearing this response, the youths immediately paled. Even Lionel grew several levels more serious. Did this mean that their best option was to ride out this force eruption until it came to an end? How long do force eruptions last? Ping, replying to Seed, it depends on the cause. What can cause force eruptions? Ping, force eruptions can be caused by the evolution of force mines, the death of powerful beasts, the evolution of worlds, the eruption of subdimensional zones. The dictionary went on to list what seemed like an endless number of cases. In the end, Lionel had no choice but to cut it off. How long will this one last? Ping, fluctuations detected. Force eruption 93% similar to evolution of fourth-dimensional force crystal mine. 37% similar to birth of crystal spirit. Calculating. 128:12:37:05. At first, Lionel didn't understand what the numbers meant, but when it clicked for him, his jaw couldn't help but clench. 128 days, 12 hours, 37 minutes and 5 seconds. When the other youths figured it out themselves, they paled even worse than they had before. How could they last for so long? That was practically half a year. Where could they get the food and water they needed? Even if they could somehow find a way to solve this problem, would they really be safe all this time? The worst part was that this was just the time it would take for the force geyser to stop. Who knew how long the force in this area would stay at a high concentration? As long as there was a vast difference between the force in this region and others, it would still be a hotbed for powerful creatures. As if all of this wasn't enough, even after the force reached an equilibrium, would that guarantee that the beasts who came would leave? What if they took this as their permanent residence? And, even if they didn't, how long would it take them to leave? If all of these things were taken into consideration, the time they needed to spend here could easily cross a year, maybe even 2 or 3. The more they thought, the more they despaired. Would this really be the place they died? Lionel's eyes narrowed. He had absolutely no intention of dying here, nor did he have any intention of staying in this place for so long. Is there any way to stop a force eruption ahead of time? Ping, the force eruption of a force crystal mine is a natural process used to increase the force concentration of an evolving world. Hearing to this point, Lionel couldn't help but despairing a bit as well. If this was a natural, necessary process, didn't that mean they had no choice but to wait? However, the next part sparked his light of hope once again. The process involves forming natural force arts. To speed up the action of drawing these natural force arts, it is necessary to infuse the force crystal mind core with high-level force strengthening deviations. Grasping onto this faint hope, Lionel's heart grew agitated. What are natural force arts and how are they related to the force crystal mine? Ping, replying to Seed, natural force arts are the creation of natural phenomena and often power naturally occurring evolutions. Complex runes are currently being slowly drawn on the force crystal mine core. The force eruption is the result of this process. After knowing this, Lionel only had one question left. What can I do to get close to a force eruption without dying? Chapter 164. That's too reckless, we can't do that. And what are we going to do if not? Wait here for death? He's right. What are we going to eat and drink? We won't last even half a week in this state. The raging debate of the youths went back and forth. It had already been 2 hours since Lionel's dictionary last spoke, yet they still hadn't come to any sort of consensus. Lionel leaned against a wall, not saying much of anything as he watched on. He had already made his decision. He would most definitely be traveling down to find the force crystal mine core. The only reason he hadn't yet was because he was allowing his body to recover. He had drawn too deeply into his reserves. Even before he battled the koi fish, that dark elemental beast had put him in a sorry state. His battle with the Spider King and Bear King only made an already bad situation worse. As if that wasn't enough, it took him another few hours to kill all the beasts that entered the same tunnel they had. For now, he needed sleep and rest. After that, he would think of a plan. He didn't know enough about how this hive was constructed. It was very possible that it was separated into segments that couldn't be accessed from one another no matter how much one walked through them. In that case, it might be necessary to exit this network of tunnels and enter again through another entrance. Thinking to this point, Lionel couldn't help but sigh to himself. Why was nothing ever easy? Unfortunately, he had learned long ago in the Mayan tomb that his internal sight couldn't penetrate walls. At best, he could snake it through the paths and look ahead. Lionel suddenly looked up, feeling that someone had suddenly sat by his side. It didn't take him long to realize that it was Roaring Black Lion even in the dim lights. It's funny to watch them, don't you think? Lionel chuckled slightly. What do you mean by that? They're separated into 2 groups. One group is too cowardly to go and wouldn't dare risk themselves. The other is also too cowardly even though they're pushing for us to go. They have no intention of putting themselves in the line of danger at all. They're only so adamant because they think we'll take on the brunt of the troubles for them. Which one do you think is worse? Roaring Black Lion did find this clown show to be quite funny. All of those powerful enough to actually make a difference weren't even speaking. Those like Lionel, him, Thunderous Clap and even King of Sea's group, were all in their own little corners of the cave. It was like they were allowing the weak to make the decision for them. The truth was that since they were the most powerful, they suffered the most to get them here. How could they have the energy to mind this argument? Most of them already made their own decision. Which is the worst? Lionel thoughtfully smiled for a moment. Probably the 7 of us who aren't speaking at all. Roaring Black Lion was shocked by Lionel's response for a moment before he broke out into laughter. Interesting, interesting. Though Roaring Black Lion's laughter caught some attention, it wasn't long before the heated discussion continued. He felt that Lionel wasn't wrong. All 7 of them were sitting back, watching those far weaker than them debate back and forth as though their opinions meant anything. It was almost like watching the truth of the world play out before them. How often did the weak argue their points, hoping to make their voices heard, only for those at the top to completely ignore them and move along as they pleased? The common people probably lamented this about their politicians all the time. Lionel sighed. He couldn't help but think of the deaths of all those commoners on the Paradise Islands. Was that really the only way to do things? If his father wasn't from a higher world, would he also be so unlucky? Sometimes he couldn't help but think he wasn't very special. Maybe one could say he worked hard, but he definitely wasn't the hardest worker. There were probably those out there working 10 times, even 100 times, harder than him. Yet, they probably didn't have even half of his results. What should he tell these people? Too bad. Be born with better parents in your next life? Seemingly sensing the heavy thoughts his innocent question brought down upon Lionel, roaring Black Lion patted his shoulder. I wanted to tell you thank you, I didn't get a chance to before. Lionel blinked. Thank you? For what? For covering my face after our battle. And, I guess for also clearing a path for all of us to get this far. I know you didn't have to. Lionel's brows raised. He didn't expect such a simple action of his to elicit such thankfulness from roaring Black Lion. He hadn't even really thought about it much back then. He only thought that since they were all obviously hiding their faces for a reason, he should help them out with that. Lionel himself didn't really care much about the mask he wore either. He only wore it for the sake of blending in. The Empire definitely knew everything about him already. At this point, there wasn't much of a need to hide himself in this way. Though that brute over there doesn't say it, he's thankful too. Roaring Black Lion said with a laugh, pointing toward Thunderous Clap. Lionel smiled. There's no need to thank me, it didn't take much effort on my part at all. Roaring Black Lion looked Lionel up and down as though trying to figure something out. What, is there something on my face? You're too easy to talk to, Sir Indomitable. Roaring Black Lion said in an overly servile manner. Lionel laughed. I didn't even pick that name, didn't you guys pick it for me? Who the hell would give you that name? Stop bullshitting. The laughter of the two men seemed to ease the tension they were feeling. However, Lionel didn't expect that another would sit beside him at this point, and it would actually be Flowing Wind. Chapter 165. Hey, hey. What do you think you're doing here, little vixen? Roaring Black Lion had an immediate reaction to Flowing Wind's appearance. It was clear that he didn't like her much. Nobody's here for you, you brute. Don't even know how to treat a lady. Roaring Black Lion was stunned speechless for a moment. Wasn't this the same woman who told him he wanted to see him break her in half? She practically had an innuendo fitted into her words every other sentence. Why was she pretending to be prim and proper now? Wasn't this too shameless? But, when he saw how she wanted to get close to Lionel, he couldn't help but roll his eyes. This little vixen really was too shameless. Lionel sensed the soft mounds pressing against his arm. He had been forced to throw away his shirt, so his torso was still completely bare at the moment, making the sensation especially tantalizing. Lionel shifted away slightly, causing Flowing Wind to pout. Unfortunately, she couldn't see Lionel's reaction with his mask. But, she subconsciously thought that he was embarrassed. Flowing Wind's gaze swept over Lionel's toned torso, her eyes lighting with an appreciative gaze. It seemed she liked what she saw, maybe a little too much. They call you Indomitable? Unfortunately. Lionel mumbled. Flowing Wind was confused by this response, but it only made her more interested in Lionel. You're quite powerful. Usually they don't let those as powerful as you out. How'd you manage to come here? Flowing Wind asked curiously. I was kidnapped. Lionel mumbled just as unenthusiastically. He wasn't sure what Flowing Wind meant by those words, but he was too lazy to ask. Anyway, I'm going to sleep. I haven't had a good night's rest in too long. Let me know what happens while I'm gone. Before the two could wonder what Lionel meant, he got up and moved to an empty corner of the cave, allowing the segmented cube to take him in. The youths watched on as the segmented cube unfolded, taking up about a 10-meter region. This was at least 10% of the cave, but no one dared to feel dissatisfied. Without Lionel they wouldn't have even made it so far. Roaring Black Lion and Flowing Wind's gazes met without Lionel between them, sparks flying. Aren't you going to scram now? Flowing Wind giggled as though she hadn't heard the words. Is that friend of yours gay? Roaring Black Lion was stunned speechless. What the hell was wrong with this woman? Even the most robust of men wouldn't care for a woman when they were that tired. There were many a fallen soldier on the battlefield that was the bedroom due to this exact reason. What a poisonous woman, poking fun at such a thing. Do you think you're that special? Roaring Black Lion retorted. Yes. Flowing Wind said shamelessly. Lionel collapsed into bed, falling into a dreamland. He felt quite thankful that that little beast that had been harassing him all this time hadn't appeared since he entered the center region of the island. While Lionel was sleeping, the commanders who were offshore of the island were battling for their lives. Violet Rain looked off into the distance toward the force geyser billowing into the skies. Her expression couldn't help but flicker between helplessness and a complicated feeling. Suddenly, another massive tentacle surged up from the turbulent sea. Damned beast, die. Her hair fluttered, turning a slight shade of dark violet. Her eyes gained the same tint as she raised her arms into the air. Violet clouds appeared above her head before a torrential rain of violet droplets fell. Screee. With every droplet that fell, another piece of flesh was melted away. In what seemed like the blink of an eye, a tentacle of over 10 meters in length became nothing more than bubbling, putrid liquid on the surface of the ocean. Violet Rain's ability was likely one of the only reasons Southern Lookout's ship had managed to last so long. The longer she kept it activated, the more toxic the surrounding waters became, and the less likely creatures were to approach them. As a result, most of the beasts took the long way around their ship, avoiding them entirely. After all, the source of the force they wanted so much wasn't coming from the commanders. However, despite this, Violet Rain's expression only grew uglier and uglier. She couldn't help but worry about the youths on the island. But, she also knew that charging ahead to go to save them would only lead to her and the crew's death. Her strength wasn't far above that of the youths. In fact, she wouldn't necessarily win in a battle against any of them. Though her ability was powerful, it was also extremely taxing to use as well. It was simply impossible for her to use it endlessly. Mellow trees. What's the situation? Have you managed to call for reinforcements yet? Violet Rain called out. We're trying our best, but the force eruption is making communication difficult. We might have to leave the range of the island entirely first. No. Violet Rain vehemently disapproved. What if the youths came to the shore looking for them? At least with her here, there was a small safe haven around the poisoned waters she created. At least the youths would stand a chance if they waited. But, if they left, what would happen to the youths? How could Violet Rain know that all of the youths she was worried about had already entered the eye of the storm? Violet Rain, we need to weigh the pros and cons here. Mellow Trees tried to persuade. Stop, stop, stop. Violet Rain waved a hand. I don't believe for a second that we are the only ones aware about this force eruption. Not only are we aware, the Eastern Lookout commanders definitely are as well. And it won't be long before the lookouts themselves are aware as well. We have to stay here and wait for reinforcements. Keep trying to see if you can get a message through. The other commanders looked at one another and sighed. Violet Rain didn't have a higher status than any of them, but she was the closest to her next promotion because her ability was rated within the S grade. For now, they could only listen to her words. Damned brat, you better not really be a spy. As long as you aren't, help those kids get out of there. Who knows how Lionel would react if he knew Violet Rain was thinking about him like this. Chapter 166. Lionel woke up, a long yawn pulling at his lips. Though he didn't sleep for as long as he wanted to, it was enough for him to regain some of his energy at the very least. He stared at the ceiling blankly, wondering what his next course of action should be. After a while of coming up with nothing, he dragged his body to the pool in the abode setting, stripping his clothes and jumping in. Before he realized what was happening, he had already fallen asleep again. When he woke up once more, he smiled bitterly to himself. It seemed that his thoughts of getting ahead of these matters could be thrown out the window now. He wasn't sure how long he had been asleep, but it was most definitely at least a day, maybe 2. With a sigh, he stood and stretched. One would expect his skin to be a bit prune-like after staying in water for so long. But, it seemed that this water was quite special. What to do? What to do? Lionel knew he needed to find the source of the force geyser, but this was easier than it sounded. Though the force geyser blew a hole through the hive, if Lionel approached it from the outside, he would only be asking for death. According to the dictionary, the only way to protect one's self against a force eruption was to form what the dictionary called force skin. This was apparently a force manipulation type technique. Force skin added a layer of protection to one's body using force. As long as one created one of high enough concentration, the force around the force eruption wouldn't detect the low force concentration within your body and would thus not try to enter your force nodes. There were a few problems with this though, the main of which was stamina. It took a lot to create such a high-density force skin. That meant that it was in their best interest to delay the time they spent in direct contact with the force geyser as much as possible. Obviously, if they wanted to do this, they couldn't enter from the top of the hive, or else their force skins would give out before they could even get close. Their best option was to take advantage of these network of tunnels to block the brunt of the force eruption and only expose themselves when they were already as close as possible. Unfortunately, this was easier said than done. Lionel absent-mindedly switched the segmented cube into its lab setting. It was only now he realized that the force concentration of the segmented cube had actually recovered so quickly. In fact, not only had it recovered, it was the highest concentration Lionel had ever seen it at. This should probably be enough for me to form my 7th and 8th nodes. Though he thought this, Lionel hesitated to do it. Without knowing where his 9th should go, he felt a bit doubtful of himself. What if he really was taking the wrong path? Maybe I should ask the dictionary. Lionel threw this to the back of his mind. Now wasn't the time to think about this. Whether he had 9 nodes or 6, he would still need to get as close to the force geyser as possible if he didn't want to die. What was more important now was figuring out how to deal with this situation. Lionel's gaze swept across the shelves of snow globes. By now, they were filled with all sorts of creatures, each perfectly preserved. He had already killed well over 200 beasts since he stepped onto this island, so there were definitely quite a number. Suddenly Lionel's eyes widened when his gaze landed on the snow globe housing the SS-grade koi fish's beast crystal. Now that he knew that even the Spider King was only of the S-grade, albeit of the elite S-grade, Lionel had a feeling the koi fish was probably just of the elite S-grade as well. He didn't believe there was a big difference between the two, it was just that the Spider King's ability was too troublesome to deal with. However, this wasn't the reason Lionel reacted like this. The moment his eyes landed on the beast crystal, an idea popped into his head. Hadn't he ignored King of Seas and Pisces' displeasure precisely so that he could use this beast crystal to create an escape-type treasure? What if instead of using it to escape, he used it to carve a straight line toward the force geyser instead? Lionel's eyes glowed like 2 bright torches when he thought to this point. He got so excited that he stirred his aching body a bit too much, causing a jolt of pain to knock him back into reality. Having the idea is one thing, but executing on it is a completely different matter. I also don't know if I have the necessary materials to make such a treasure. Lionel's brow furrowed, but then he suddenly thought of something. If the dictionary could scan and find zones, could it scan and find other things? If that was the case, maybe it wasn't even necessary for him to refine this treasure now. Are you able to find your way through these tunnels? Lionel asked expectantly. Ping, replying to Seed, Father Overlord has not programmed this function into the dictionary. When Seed is skilled enough, it will be possible to upgrade and modify the dictionary himself. Lionel almost couldn't refrain from rolling his eyes. He should have expected that his father would program in a name like that for himself. What kinds of things can you scan for, then? Ping, replying to Seed, the dictionary can scan for anything within its database. Lionel shook his head at this response. Clearly this was making things more complicated than it needed to be. Essentially, this dictionary had the technology necessary to scan these minds, but not the programming necessary to turn this into useful information for him. It was either that this was an oversight, or his old man was purposely making things difficult for him. Taking a deep breath, Lionel threw these things to the back of his mind. Scan for veins within this network of tunnels for me. Lionel didn't believe that a hive that hosted a force crystal mine core didn't have other ores lying in wait for his use. This was the ideal environment for the formation of such treasures. Since he didn't have the materials he needed, he would just have to mine them on his own. Chapter 167. When Lionel reappeared within the cave, several eyes looked toward him at once. Their reactions were so quick that Lionel could practically hear the wind their spinning heads caused. Towards such a reaction, he could only smile bitterly. It seemed that they really had been waiting for him. Not a single person was missing from the time he had left to now. What else could they be doing if not waiting for him? Have you all come to a decision? Lionel asked. The youths looked at one another, but it seemed that the answer to the question was no. They had likely just gotten tired of arguing and let the matter rest for now. At least, that was what Lionel had thought before he realized that many of them were even avoiding his gaze as though being embarrassed by something. What about you all? Lionel asked with narrowed eyes. Though it was the same question, this time, Lionel very obviously aimed it toward the 6 others who could be considered near his level of strength. Pisces stood upon hearing these words, walking toward Lionel with a confident expression. Though there didn't seem to be disdain in her gaze, this was only because she knew that Lionel was much more powerful than she was. However, there seemed to be something that had greatly boosted her boldness regardless. While you were away, we came to a consensus as a group. Oh? Did you? Lionel looked past Pisces, sending a questioning gaze toward the others. He only got a shrug from Roaring Black Lion. Thunderous Clap avoided his gaze as though he too was embarrassed. As for Chasing Wind, though she met his gaze, there was a tinge of guilt within her eyes. But, for some reason, she would feel even more guilty not meeting Lionel's gaze, so she put an effort to not look away. As for Flowing Wind, she was observing the situation as though she was a passerby, happy to see the world burn. Though Lionel couldn't see their faces, making it difficult to tell their true intentions, he still had a good idea. Roaring Black Lion didn't seem to care about what was going on. He only shrugged to show that he had nothing to do with what was happening, but he couldn't do much to change anything either. Thunderous Clap likely put the most effort into trying to stop what was happening, but he too couldn't move the needle. He seemed to take this much harder than Roaring Black Lion, something that made Lionel smile beside himself. He found this Thunderous Clap to be quite adorable. As for Chasing Wind, her gaze seemed to make it seem like she had made the most logical decision for herself. As such, though she felt bad for Lionel, it wasn't to the extent of changing her decision. Her actions of meeting his gaze was to let him know this. Interesting. The last person Lionel looked at was King of Seas. He seemed to have the most sour look in his eyes as though he was losing out even more than Lionel. After seeing this, Lionel had a decent idea of what decision these people had come to. I don't agree. Before Pisces could even explain what was going on, Seer suddenly called out. I don't agree either. Precious Moment affirmed Seer's words. The 2 of them had been saved by Lionel at a critical moment. Had it not been for Lionel, they would be dead. How could they agree to this? In truth, it wasn't just them that had been saved. Even setting aside the fact that Lionel taking the vanguard had kept their casualties to a minimum, there were many others he had directly saved just like the 2 of them. Your opinions were already heard. We came to a consensus as a group. Further words are meaningless. I'm sure you already remember the vote totals. Pisces spoke coldly, not allowing the 2 to say any more. She swept a glance of indifference toward them before looking back toward Lionel with her lofty expression as though everything was playing to her tune. In your absence, we decided that our best chance at survival was for you to hand over the SS-grade beast crystal to me. As long as I ingest it, there is a high chance my ability will mutate to gain some characteristics of the koi fish. In that case, maneuvering through these tunnels will become much safer for us all and we'll be able to follow the advice your treasure gave us. That day, they had all heard the words of the dictionary. So, they knew well the importance of approaching as closely to the force geyser as possible before facing its direct might. If Pisces could awaken this ability, it really would be their best chance. Lionel didn't have much of a reaction to this. Instead, he looked toward King of Seas. And why did everyone choose you and not him? A tinge of red flashed by King of Seas' gaze. It seemed that he now hated Pisces just as much as he hated Lionel. But, there was nothing he could do about it anymore. Pisces sneered, thinking that Lionel wanted to sow discord. But, she replied calmly as though everything was still easily within her grasp. In her opinion, the big obstacle had been King of Seas, not Lionel. It wasn't because the former was more powerful than the latter, but because only the former could sway public opinion away from her. It's simple, really. King of Seas' affinity with water can only be considered auxiliary. His main ability is his transformation into a merman. This allows him greater defense, strength and speed, in addition to a boost to these things while in the presence of water. Of course, he also gains the ability to breathe underwater as well. Pisces explained patiently and without hurry. However, water manipulation is my main ability. Compared to him, the likelihood of my ability mutating is far higher. So, if we were to take a chance on anyone, it should most definitely be me. Numerous people nodded to this, even Chasing Wind. It seemed that she had also been swayed by this logic. It did indeed make sense. And, in Chasing Wind's opinion, it would be quite selfish of Lionel to refuse. After all, he didn't have a water ability. I hope you don't take offense to this. Chasing Wind suddenly spoke. In fact, if Lionel thought about it, this was the first time he had ever heard her voice. We are only trying out best with what we have. Had you had a water ability, none of us would have agreed to this. Lionel nodded toward this. He indeed didn't feel angry about this. That said, I understand where you all are coming from and there isn't anything wrong with your line of thinking. Pisces' smile bloomed when she heard this, almost as though the beast crystal was already in her hands. Unfortunately, I still can't agree. Toward this, Pisces' expression could only darken. Chapter 168. You. Pisces swallowed her anger and regained her calm. Are you sure that's the decision you want to make? I know that you are very powerful, but this is a matter of life and death for us all. Do you understand this? Lionel could already sense several hostile gazes aimed toward him. The only ones who didn't seem to have this reaction were Seer and Precious Moment, along with Roaring Black Lion, Thunderous Clap, and, surprisingly, King of Seas. It seemed the last took quite a bit of pleasure in Lionel rejecting Pisces. Of course, there was also Flowing Wind who seemed excited by this turn of events. Only now would she be able to watch the best show. Calming Wind furrowed her brows, looking toward Lionel with disappointment. Lionel shook his head. These people really wanted to fight him? He had to admit, he really couldn't beat them all. This space was too restricted, for one. And, secondly, his body still hadn't recovered from making sure they all got here safely, ironically. Of course, if he wanted to run, he didn't think that any of them had the speed to keep up with him, but, without the map of the tunnels, there was no telling whether or not he would run into a dead end before he escaped. Of course, he had already memorized the path they took to get here, but that led outside. What was he going to do, run back to those beast legions? Who knew what kind of wild nonsense was happening out there right now? Ultimately, he really didn't have the ability to deal with all of them. Though he was disappointed in what was happening, he could understand where they all were coming from. Those from the southern lookouts still had a somewhat jaded opinion of him. It was only due to his recent actions that those ill feelings began to turn around somewhat. However, humans were creatures who often fell victim to groupthink and confirmation bias. Whatever good impression they had of Lionel was easily overridden by his actions now. To an outside observer, his actions did indeed seem selfish. As from one perspective, Lionel didn't have to give his things to others if he didn't feel like it. But, this time, this matter involved all of their lives. How could they just sit idly by? Indomitable, don't be so shameless. This isn't about you. Ruptured Artery, who already hated Lionel to the core to begin with, couldn't help but to stand out at this moment. The rowdiness of the group of youths seemed to only grow with each passing moment. Pisces didn't even have to say a word and many had already defended her position for her. That's enough, this doesn't need to devolve to violence. Calming Wind finally stood from her seated position, walking toward Lionel. Indomitable, please think of the overall situation. Is it really appropriate for you to act in this way? Lionel was starting to feel a bit annoyed. After all, he was human. As much as he wanted to be understanding, he had limited patience as well. But, still, since he knew their intentions weren't overly sinister, he kept whatever bubbling dissatisfaction he had down. Instead of exploding with anger, he flipped a palm, allowing a familiar silver disc to appear. Scan her ability. Lionel said calmly. Ping, generating nomenclature. Evolution stage, Tier 6 Black, Evolution type, Elemental, Evolution, Water Sense, Water Manipulation, Water Sense, Greater affinity for water elemental force. 50% boost in comprehension and power in using water-based force techniques. Water Manipulation, control over the water element. Pisces widened her eyes. Even the Slayer Legion lookout hadn't been capable of giving such sharp analysis of her ability. What was going on? And, more importantly, what was Lionel's purpose? What is the likelihood she would gain the water metamorphosis ability upon absorbing the koi fish's beast crystal? Ping, replying to Seed, Father Overlord did not program this function into the dictionary. Once you are skilled enough, it will be possible to upgrade the dictionary. Pisces, whose heart had constricted, sighed a breath of relief. Her smile bloomed once more as she felt Lionel's display had failed. What would he do now that his little trick was going nowhere? Lionel, seemingly having expected this, though, didn't show much of a reaction. What are the chances of mutating an ability upon the ingestion of a beast crystal? It seemed that the dictionary wasn't able to perform ultra-specific tasks. Lionel had a feeling that his father purposely created it this way. Like this, he would be able to gain supplementary knowledge without relying on the dictionary to do every and anything for him. Ping, replying to Seed, without a crystal absorption technique, the likelihood is 1 in 10,000. With a crystal absorption technique, the odds are closer to 1 in 10. Pisces' expression, which had just regained some color, paled once again. She definitely didn't have such a technique, or else she definitely wouldn't have reacted this way. But, after a moment, she recovered again. I get it, you've proved your point. Pisces said calmly. But, compared to you who has a 0% chance, my odds are still better. Those who had begun to falter after hearing the odds steeled their hearts. Pisces was right. A 1% in a 1% chance was still better than a 0% chance. Lionel pretended as though he hadn't heard Pisces. What are the chances a force crafter has in extracting a specific ability from a beast crystal? Ping, a force crafter with a crystal spirit familiar has a 100% chance. All other force crafters have a percentage chance depending on their skill and their strength in comparison to the beast the crystal was taken from. What are the lowest odds? Ping, replying to Seed, about 10 to 20% as long as the beast crystal shares its dimensional grade with the force crafter. If trying to extract an ability from a higher dimensional creature, 0%. Am I a force crafter? Ping, yes. What are my odds of success? Ping, S, taking Seed's ability into consideration, Seed has a 78% chance of success. And if I awaken my metal synergy lineage factor? Ping, that would allow Seed to take greater advantage of the senses of Seed's metal spirit, which would boost the chance of sensing the ability in question. In this case, it will be about 92%. The more Lionel spoke, the paler Pisces became. It was as though she could see the beast crystal she thought of in her dreams slipping away. Chapter 169. Lionel was pleasantly surprised that the dictionary was able to give him the odds he needed. He was prepared for it to be unable to do so, just like it wasn't able to read Pisces' specific odds. But, if he thought about it, it made a bit of sense. The dictionary his father left him had two major purposes. The first was to inform him about things he was ignorant of, and the second was to guide his force crafting. It made sense that it was unable to use its scanning ability for tasks unrelated to force crafting, but could when the topic at hand was crafting itself. Since it's like this, it's a bit more acceptable. Lionel nodded to himself. I think a 78% chance is better than a 0.001% chance, right? Lionel asked. Pisces gritted her teeth, but she really had no response. Force crafting? This was already an incredibly rare profession to begin with. For those of Earth who had just taken their first step toward evolution, the rarity was even more exaggerated. The force crafters of Earth could be slotted into two categories. Either they were curious scientists who held positions as researchers even before the metamorphosis descended, or they were among the very few who awakened force crafting-related abilities. This was all to say that this profession wasn't prevalent in their minds. They could have never imagined that someone with combat effectiveness as high as Lionel would also be a force crafter. In fact, there were many of them who still didn't know what a force crafter even was. I hope you all see now that I wasn't trying to be selfish. I really am our best chance. If there's anyone else with a higher probability, I really wouldn't mind handing the beast crystal over. Lionel wasn't saying this just to say it. He really did see the point of view of the youths around him. Their ask of him might have seemed unfair from one perspective, but it was also not overboard either. In addition, even if he had to give the koi fish's beast crystal over, he could still bet on himself by trying to complete a similar treasure using the Bear King's beast crystal. The only reason he had set it aside for now was because the Bear King's body was contaminated. At this point, Calming Wind felt a bit embarrassed. She had gone from, albeit somewhat reluctantly, meeting Lionel's gaze, to now wanting to find a place to hide herself as quickly as possible. Bowing her head slightly, she apologized sincerely. I'm sorry. She didn't say anything else as she retreated, causing Lionel to have a better impression of her. It seemed that the youths from the southern lookout really weren't bad. It's not a big deal, I didn't take any of it personally. Lionel replied, causing many to sigh a breath of relief. The gritting of Pisces' teeth was practically audible. She had been so close, all for it to come crumbling down. How can we take your treasure's word seriously? How do we know you didn't make it say that? The moment she spoke these words, she instantly regretted it. Her hatred had clouded her vision, causing her to say something stupid. At that point, it wasn't just Lionel who looked toward her with a weird gaze. If she didn't trust the dictionary so much, why did she use its words as an excuse before when she thought getting the beast crystal was possible? It seemed more than a little selfish to say something like this now. Forget it, do whatever you want. Pisces was unwilling to hear the response she was sure she'd receive, so she cut her losses quickly, retreating to her previous sitting position. Lionel sighed when he saw the animosity in her eyes. Everything had been so much easier before the metamorphosis. I still need some time to finish the craft. A few days to find the materials I need and another few days to blueprint everything. In at most a week, it should be completed. The youths nodded toward Lionel's words, but they were still feeling a bit anxious. It had only been 2 days since they entered this cave, but there were already many problems to face. Many of them wanted to wash themselves, but had no place to do so. Compounding with that, there was no place for them to release themselves, so many had to travel out of the cave to find uninhabited corners to release their bowels. It was the kind of situation that most definitely couldn't last for very long. Luckily, many of them had come with abode-type treasures. After all, they knew comfort would be a luxury on the hunt. It was thanks to this that things were somewhat better. But the reserves of water and food would be quickly eaten into. Seeing this, Lionel knew he had to settle their hearts. So, without hesitation, he took out 3 large beast corpses. Those of you with fire abilities, help the others separate out and cook this meat. Don't worry, I have enough meat to last us a few months. As for water, Lionel turned a gaze toward Pisces. I hope that Pisces will help us out with this. With the density of force in the air and the help of your ability, I'm sure that condensing large amounts of water from the air shouldn't be a problem, right? Pisces' eyes flashed with a clever glint, but in the next moment, she poured a bucket of cold water over her own schemes. The same way she could use public opinion to sway Lionel, Lionel could do the same to her as well. In fact, it was even more effective on her since Lionel was so much stronger than she was. If she really tried to withhold water from these youths, her ending wouldn't be very good. In the end, she could only nod. Lionel smiled brightly, taking off his mask. The youths were stunned by this, not thinking he would do such a thing. So handsome. Flowing Wind's eyes lit up as though she wanted to eat Lionel up from where he stood. You can all call me Lionel. We're all in this together. Lionel said lightly. I'm not here to lead you all, nor will I make you do anything you don't want to do. As long as we stick together, getting out won't be a problem. I promise. TCH, you pretty playboy. Roaring Black Lion said. Don't you know saying such flowery words only makes them want to follow you more? His sudden comment made many look at one another and burst into laughter. It felt like a weight that had been on everyone's shoulders suddenly dissipated. Chapter 170. After settling everything, Lionel stepped out from the cave, numerous eyes on his back as he vanished into the darkness. Watching his receding figure, King of Seas couldn't help but laugh. It seemed he got a kick out of seeing Pisces eating shit. All the anger he had had in the past day vanished into thin air, leaving him feeling comfortable. It could only be said that humans were indeed weird creatures. King of Seas had gone from hating Lionel's guts to supporting him in the span of a day. As for Pisces, she could only hatefully glare in Lionel's direction, but there was nothing she could do. Just like the logic had once been on her side, it was now on his. As if that wasn't bad enough, she didn't expect Lionel to have so much charisma. Lionel leisurely strolled through the dark tunnels. Though he was still feeling the pain of his injuries and there was a severe lack of light in his surroundings, he was quite comfortable now. This might be a better opportunity than I originally gave it credit for. Lionel smiled so widely his eyes squinted. The reason Lionel was so happy was because when he asked the dictionary to scan the surroundings for veins, the results had been far beyond his expectations. The hive was practically a treasure trove. Though the force eruption was only now occurring, it could be said that this force crystal mine had been maturing for a long time already. As a result, this was the best environment Earth had for the creation of fourth-dimensional minerals. Not only was the presence of pseudo-fourth-dimensional minerals incredibly high, but there were even some veins that had already manifested true fourth-dimensional minerals. It could be said that Earth's progress in metallurgy was far beyond that of many worlds of their stature. However, the fundamental truth was that these alloys were still fragile in the face of force. This was why Lionel had to fuse herb ore into the alloys he took from the sniper rifle. If he didn't do this, his pistol crafts would have been even more fragile than they were now. However, if Lionel were to use pseudo and true fourth-dimensional metals in his crafts, he would be able to create higher-grade crafts with less effort. In addition, even though fourth-dimensional metals he was still too weak to refine could be saved for the future. In all likelihood, these metals would be very valuable even in true fourth-dimensional worlds. But now, Lionel practically had them all to himself. Thanks to the dictionary, he could easily find them through the thick walls. And, with the help of little Tolly, the mining process wouldn't be much of an issue either. Seemingly sensing Lionel's excitement, the little metal spirit coiling around his fingers bubbled with happiness, eager to be of help. Lionel smiled lightly, watching the little guy play around his hands. Alright, the first target is the closest, a vein of whispering breeze or, Lionel quickly made his way forward. He ran into several dead ends at first since the dictionary could only point him in the general direction, but he eventually inched closer, memorizing the pathways as he went along. Soon, Lionel had made it to a seemingly ordinary wall of earth. Other than being slightly damp and cold to the touch, there was nothing different about it. But Lionel trusted the dictionary. "All right, little guy, let's start." Little Tolly split into numerous little silver balls, bouncing around Lionel's hands with excitement before it coated the latter's palms. Lionel pressed his hands into the wall, entering spirit unity and using Tolliver's keen senses toward valuable minerals to see the hidden veins. There it is. After sensing it, Lionel began to channel force into his metal spirit. Not much unlike projecting the shape of the part he wanted, Lionel made sure to only carefully carve away the pieces of earth not related to the valuable ore. In truth, little Tolly did most of the work. Even without Lionel's support, it was made to melt away and absorb minerals. In fact, it might very well be possible for Lionel to rely on his familiar to carve a path toward the force eruption rather than forging a craft with the koi fish's beast crystal. The only reason he hadn't was because he didn't want to overwork the little guy. Carving out a bit of rock covering a vein was one thing, but digging through hundreds of meters of earth was a complete other thing. Soon, a silvery green metal shone before Lionel. It had quite a resplendent light as though it was crowned by a halo. Higher dimensional metals always had halos like this. The only exception was black herb Oregon. As long as it was within a world beneath its dimensional grade, it would always shine like this as though scared others were unaware of its value. The more dimensional grades a metal surpassed its current world by, the grander the halos that covered it would be. Similar logic followed for other natural treasures and even beasts and humans. Whispering Breeze Ore. It's an excellent wind elemental vessel and known for its sharpness and light weight. Not bad. It might be useful when I finally get around to making the movement treasure. Lionel would often think of Captain Sella's chariot. Though she was a vile human being, her chariot wasn't at fault. Elemental vessels were a type of ore. Just like herb ore, which was a great foundational metal, known for its ability to stabilize two opposing minerals that would otherwise not mesh, there were other families of metals as well. Elemental vessels was a family that had an advantage toward containing certain elemental force types. As a wind elemental vessel, Whispering Breeze Ore was exceptionally good at containing the wind element. It also got its name due to its high level of stability. It's able to take in a large amount of wind element and make use of it while maintaining quiet and steady operation. This was quite ideal for forging a vehicle. Lionel smiled brightly. For the little guy, chewing through the normal rock around the vein wasn't a problem. It didn't even take half an hour before it was completely exposed. After that, Lionel could practically pull out the whole thing with his bare hands. One down, hopefully many more to go. I'll definitely need to find a good water elemental vessel. If I can find a dual water-earth elemental vessel, I might be able to make the craft even better by integrating the koi fishes and the Bear King's beast crystals. It seemed the saying really was true. There were only benefits to gain in the midst of danger. At any other time, such a large treasury of minerals would have been monopolized by the Empire or the Slayer Legion. But now, as much as Lionel could take, he would take. Chapter 171. Many hours later, one could find Lionel in a familiar position. His hands were pressed flush against a wall as force slowly flowed out from his hands. Though this seemed simple for him, it was actually quite difficult. Since he forewent placing force nodes in his hands, it was a bit more difficult for him in comparison to another to achieve this result. But, with how high his spirit was, how could his force control not also be great? Soon, another ore had manifested. This time, it radiated a dirty gold light. It was quite similar to the fur coat of the Bear King, albeit much less resplendent. Black-tempered vein ore. Lionel smiled happily. Vein ores were another family of metals. They could be considered another ore type that was almost as important as herb ores. However, they were just barely lacking. In truth, the value of vein ores was above herb ores. However, the reason herb ores could be considered a step above in usefulness was because it had an impossibly wide variety of applications. One could use herb ores in practically every force craft imaginable. It was for this reason that the universal currency of the universe were herb coins. However, vein ores were used in particularly intricate creations. They had characteristics very similar to force pathways that linked one's force nodes. When they were used in crafts, they allowed force to flow more freely. That said, this wasn't the most important use of vein ores. Their greatest use was in drawing more permanent force arts. Take for example Lionel's pistol craft. He had to draw the force arts directly onto the alloys he fused with his black herb Oregon. However, had he liquefied a compatible vein ore first, and then used it to inscribe the force arts, their power would gain a great boost. In addition, it would greatly strengthen the nozzles as well, allowing them to withstand many more shots. There was a final more secretive use of vein ores as well. In fact, Lionel wouldn't even be aware of this had it not been for the words of the creator of Dimensional Cleanse. According to the creator, there was a special type of vein ore that could be absorbed. The special energies of this vein ore could be used to strengthen one's force nodes. Though this wouldn't increase the amount of force one could hold, there were many other benefits to this. Firstly, it would be possible to replenish one's force nodes faster. It was necessary for many to artificially cap their consumption of force to avoid damaging one's force nodes. Though force nodes are self-created, they can't be willfully abandoned. This is a law enforced by the universe itself. So, injuries to force nodes needed to be avoided at all costs. Secondly, this would make it easier to compress force nodes in the future when it becomes necessary to cross the boundary of a higher dimensional body. For someone like Lionel, this second point was especially important. Though his force nodes being constructed of 100 cells sounded grandiose, the truth was that this made his future path far more difficult as well. The more force he had, the harder it was to compress, and the more pressure there would be on his body. The third reason was enough for any force cultivator to go wild with greed. Everyone was limited in the number and length of force pathways they could create. Especially in the beginning phases of creating a fourth-dimensional body, many could only connect their force nodes via a single path. But this greatly limited their force-wielding abilities. With the help of a special vein ore, it was possible to create many more force pathways, allowing one to unlock many force-wielding abilities usually reserved for higher-dimensional warriors. This aside, there was a fourth reason that would greatly benefit Lionel even now. If his force nodes were sturdier, wouldn't it also be much easier to withstand the force eruption? Unfortunately, black-tempered vein ore wasn't the vein ore he needed to undergo this process. In addition, according to the author of Dimensional Cleanse, it was best to wait until forming all 9 nodes before undergoing this tempering process. So, no matter how eager Lionel was for this benefit, he could only throw it to the back of his mind. Alright, I think I've cleared out all the ore veins in this section of tunnels. As expected, not all the tunnels are linked. If I want to explore more tunnels, I'll have to leave the hive and enter through another entrance. Lionel was hesitant to do this. He didn't know what the situation was outside. If he left, he would probably expose everyone to danger again. Even if he set everyone else apart, he still needed to worry about himself. After all, he would still need a while longer to recover to his peak. Forget it, forget it. I've harvested enough for now and have all the materials I need. Even though I didn't find a dual water-earth elemental vessel ore, I did find an earth one. If I combined that with the rushing river vein ore I found, it would still be possible to combine the 2 beast crystal abilities. Much like elemental vessels, there were different types of vein ores as well. Rushing river vein ores were especially good at inscribing for water elemental force arts. So, if Lionel was careful with his planning, it would be possible to combine the 2 without much issue. Just like before, Lionel took his time to dig the entire vein out. He knew that if he kept the core of the vein intact, it might be possible for the vein to grow more ores for him in the future. Who knows, maybe the segmented cube had this ability as well. Even if it didn't, Lionel would still do this. Just when Lionel was content with his gains and about to return to the cave to get started on the blueprints, his steps suddenly froze. There, on the wall he just extracted the vein from, there were faint cracks. It was incredibly difficult to spot, but there seemed to be a faint light coming from the other side. If it wasn't for the fact most of the hive was so dark, it wouldn't have been so hard for Lionel to spot the cracks because even if his side was dark, the other side would be flooded with light. This part of the wall is so thin. I can probably pass my internal sight through then to see if it's worth getting little Tolly's help to knock it away. It might not necessarily be a good thing to have a path to another network of tunnels. After having this thought, Lionel snaked his internal sight forward, passing through the gaps to see what was on the other side. But the result left him stunned speechless. Not only was the other side almost like an entire separate world, what shocked him the most was that there were actually other people there. Not just the fact they were other people, but the fact they were other people with characteristics Lionel was all too familiar with. Red hair, red eyes. The Brazinger clan? Chapter 172. Lionel was shocked. The very last group of people he could have ever expected to find here was the Brazinger clan. Wasn't this the personal island of the Slayer Legion? Didn't they monitor it? Were they really so incompetent to allow others to sneak in here so easily? Lionel had already had a hard time taking the Slayer Legion seriously, but it felt as though their every action really only made him look down on them more. After a while, he calmed himself. He realized that he had only reacted like this because of how hard the past few days had been. It seemed that even he needed someone to vent his frustration on. Stay calm. Lionel closed his eyes, steadying his breathing and his heart rate. He had already promised himself to remain calm in all things. It was still hard since he was just an 18-year-old boy, but not everyone was made perfect in a day. In time, he'd temper his disposition. After Lionel steadied himself, he began thinking of what could possibly be happening here. He doubted that the Brazinger clan had come in after them. There was a high probability they had come here first. In that case, could it be the force eruption was predicted by them? Or was it that they wanted to take advantage of the ore treasury that was this hive? There's another possibility as well. Lionel furrowed his brows. According to Old Hutch, things aren't so simple as they seem on the surface. Could it be that these Project Hunt Islands were never the sole property of the Slayer Legion to begin with? When Lionel had this thought, he felt that his whole world had been turned upside down. Hutch seemed to talk like the decision to let the commoners of the Paradise Islands die was a mutual decision. Was the relationship between the rebels and the Empire really so simple? The more Lionel thought about it, the more confused he became. Forget it, thinking about it myself won't get me anywhere. I'll observe them first. The space on the other side of the cracks really did seem like an entirely different world. It felt as though one had to step inside a spatial crack to reach it, but the truth of the matter was that it was within the hive just like every place else. Though the space was dark much like the other network of tunnels, there was a dim halo of light around it. This light didn't come from the sun, but rather the countless plants littered all around. That was right, this space within the hive looked no different than a garden. And, the halos of light being emitted from the plants were none other than the halos natural treasures had in the presence of a lower dimensional world. There didn't seem to be any large source of water anywhere within the cave, making their existence baffling. The only hints of liquid were the drippings that fell from the stalactites on the ceiling. Mellow dew stalactites. Lionel trembled slightly. Mellow dew stalactites could form a single drop a day. Each one of these drops were the greatest nourishment for natural treasures, whether those natural treasures were plants like the ones in this cave space, or the current ores in Lionel's possession. The dewdrops also had exceptionally high concentrations of force. They could essentially liquefy force, creating what could be classified as a force-strengthening deviation despite the fact it had no other characteristics aside from its high concentrations. Just to put these matters into perspective, just a single drop from these stalactites was enough to form any one of Lionel's stars. This was how exaggerated the matter was. Yet, the ceiling of this place was formed by at least 50 mellow dew stalactites. It was no wonder this place didn't need any water to grow so many wonderful plants. A single drop of that dew would be enough to raise even an acre of fourth-dimensional plants without issue. Unfortunately, Lionel didn't know what these plants were. He could tell they were valuable, but he wasn't a force pill refiner, so how could he know anything about them? Luckily, he could rely on the dictionary if need be. He was certain these higher dimensional plants were in its database. Wow, I didn't think we'd find something like this. How do you think these plants managed to grow here? There were two men, both of similar stature. They seemed to realize they had stumbled upon something valuable, but they didn't know how valuable it was. Their knowledge was limited. All they knew was that due to all these halos of light, these were definitely at least fourth-dimensional herbs. Let's mark this place down and let the young lord know about it. Right now, the priority is still to find a path toward the Force Crystal Mine. We're running out of time. Lionel's gaze flashed. Young lord? Could he be talking about that monocle guy? A hardly concealed rage flashed through Lionel's gaze. He had always been one who found it difficult to kill. It was only after countless battles that his heart began to slowly accept the kind of world he lived in now. However, if there was someone he wouldn't hesitate to kill, two someones, actually, it was the junior Governor Duke and that monocle-wearing young lord of the Brazinger clan. It seems they split up to cover more ground. Their aim is also the Force Crystal Mine. I can't guarantee that monocle-wearing bastard won't be interested enough in this place to set everything aside to come here first. These two might not know the value of mellow dew stalactite, but that doesn't mean he won't. A resolute glint took hold of Lionel's gaze. Though he was injured, he was still confident in taking on these two. Plus, if he could capture them, he might be able to dig out more information about what the Brazinger clan was doing here and if they had any connection to the Slayer Legion. No, they shouldn't have a connection, or else we wouldn't have been sent here at this time. Even as Lionel was thinking this, he had already sprung into action. Taking advantage of the darkness, he stealthily had little Tolly devour the thin, cracked wall and rolled into the world of grass and plants. Without hesitation, he quickly followed after the two men who had just left the wide space of greenery. Chapter 173. Lionel looked down toward two unconscious men. He had already guessed that taking them down wouldn't have been a problem, but even he hadn't expected it to be so easy. In fact, it could be said that he was a bit too heavy-handed. However, Lionel hadn't had a choice. This whole knocking people out and taking hostages things was completely new to him. TV shows always made it look so easy. Just a simple karate chop to the back of the neck, right? So why had it given him such a headache? Forget it. I'll use those vines to tie them up in the segmented cube and bring them back. How do I harvest these plants? Lionel asked. Ping, replying to Seed, the best choice is to make use of the segmented cube's suspended animation ability. Suspended animation? Lionel was confused for a second before he understood. Oh. It must mean the snow globes. The snow globes of the lab setting had always been a mystery to Lionel. At first, he had thought there was a finite number. But, after he had collected the corpses of a couple hundred beasts, he realized that the snow globes multiplied without end. It seemed there would always be enough for his needs. Also, he realized that corpses weren't the only thing he could hold in them. All of the ores he had collected had been taken in by them as well. What exactly does the suspended animation ability do? Lionel asked. Ping, suspended animation, Phase 1 ability of the segmented cube's lab setting. It is able to house the living and the dead in the exact state they entered as no matter how much time has passed, evading the harshness of the passage of time. Lionel nodded. This was about what he had expected. His spatial bracelet could somewhat replicate this feat, but it wasn't the exact same. The reason why things in his spatial bracelet were non-perishable was because living things couldn't exist within it. As a result, there was no bacteria or fungi, so how could things go bad? But, from the explanation of the dictionary, it seemed that the ability of the snow globes was far more profound than this. It also didn't seem like it restricted the living either. This is perfect. I was worrying about how I would store all these plants, but if this is the case there shouldn't be a problem. Though everything seemed to be going smoothly initially, Lionel was soon lamenting his plight. Unfortunately, the space within each snow globe was limited. So, he had to uproot each plant individually before moving on. how could this not leave him feeling aggrieved? If the lab setting could produce these snow globes endlessly, why couldn't it make one with more space in it? Soon, Lionel realized that it wasn't a matter of space. Despite the Bear King being over 5 meters tall, it still fit in one. Yet, these plants, root and all, were barely a foot tall in most cases, but they took up an entire snow globe to themselves. It seemed that the ability of the suspended animation wasn't as simple as Lionel thought. It was likely that the snow globe was capable of perfectly adapting to the object it took in, adjusting its settings appropriately depending on the item. Unsurprisingly, it took Lionel several hours to take in every plant. It would have been faster, but he didn't want to accidentally harm them. So, he could only move slowly. Soon, the garden had fallen into darkness, the only hint of light coming from the shimmering stalactites above. Lionel gasped for breath, stretching out his back. Plundering treasures is actually such hard work. Though he said this, he looked around the garden with a sigh. Who knew how many years it had taken for it to reach this state? He wanted to take away the soil beneath his feet and the stalactite on the ceiling of the space, but he really had no means to. It had already taken him so long just to uproot the plants, how could he shovel all this soil into the segmented cube? Even aside from that, he had no idea where to even begin with the stalactites. They were easily 20 meters above him and each the size of a tall human man. Just when Lionel felt that he could only leave such treasures behind, the segmented cube appeared on its own again. It separated into its jigsaw-like puzzles and shot across the room, enveloping it completely. Lionel blinked and by the time his vision cleared, the once beautiful garden had become just as bland as every other cave in this place. The only hint that it was once something more were the vines and lush patches of moss that covered the walls. Lionel was speechless. If it could do this, why the hell had it let him waste so many hours here? Forget it, all the things his father left him were too mischievous. He couldn't help but feel that they were making fun of him at every corner. Let's clear out the ores in this network of tunnels then return to the group. I shouldn't leave them for so long. Lionel didn't hesitate any longer. He didn't know how long it would take for the rest of the Brazinger clan to notice the absence of their 2 family members, so he worked quickly, exploring the new network of tunnels. His luck was great. He managed to find a water elemental vessel. Though it would have been better to find a dual water-earth elemental vessel, having a water and an earth elemental vessel was definitely the second best option. He also found more vein ores that would give him greater flexibility in the force arts he could draw and even found a few large deposits of herb ores. It was clear that this network of tunnels was more greatly influenced by the force eruption and thus had more treasures. As expected from this conclusion, Lionel found that this network of tunnels had several paths leading several tens of meters downward. Since this is the case, it'll be easier to make it to the force crystal mine if this is our starting point. Lionel quickly made his way back to where the garden once was. Then, making use of the vines and bits of moss that remained, he cleverly covered up the hole he had come from. Afterward, he made his way back to the cave the youths had taken as their base. Chapter 174. Wake up. Lionel spoke coldly, pouring a bucket of frigid water he had gotten from Pisces over the heads of the 2 Brazinger clan members. In truth, Lionel had no need to get his water from Pisces, he only did it as a show. Since he had the Black Grade Soothing Waters pool, he was much better off than those drinking normal water. Still, he made a show of politely asking Pisces for water every day to try and smooth her attitude out a bit. Like this, it was much easier to maintain the balance of the group and it made her feel more comfortable thinking she had a modicum of power over him. Though, if Pisces knew that the precious water she so graciously bestowed to Lionel was being used in this way, it could be imagined how she would react. The 2 Brazinger clan men were startled awake. Their first attempt was to move, but upon realizing their hands and feet were bound, a tinge of fear colored their hearts. Lionel wasn't worried that one of their abilities could help them escape. Before he woke them up, he had the dictionary scan them. The one with the more square jaw had an auxiliary type ability that made his neurons fire faster, thus giving him greater reaction time and greater thinking speed. The one with the slightly thinner face had a vibration-type ability. This one was a greater threat, but Lionel had already crafted the cuffs on his hands to be beyond his ability to vibrate out of. After realizing that the two of them had been captured, the two clan members glared toward Lionel. But, inwardly they were feeling confused. There were others here? How was this possible? First, tell me your names. Lionel asked simply. After a while, it became obvious to Lionel that they had no intention of responding to him. But, seemingly having expected this result, he only nonchalantly nodded. With a wave of his hand, the poisoned corpse of the Bear King appeared, causing the two men to pale. This poison is pretty tyrannical, don't you think? Lionel said casually. After a few moments, he stood and pulled the thinner man away. At such a sight, the square-jawed man trembled violently, the fear evident in his eyes. No. No. I'll tell you my name, I'll tell you my name. Unfortunately, no matter how hard he struggled, he and Lionel still vanished, leaving the square-jawed man in a sorry state. He was so scared that he directly fainted, unable to maintain his consciousness. However, he had no idea that Lionel and the thin-faced man had simply gone to the abode setting, letting his fear stew. Oh, you'll tell me your name now? Lionel asked. Yes. Yes. My name is Sherry. A weird expression coated Lionel's visage at these words. Sherry? That meant darling in French. The man sure had quite the unique name. All right then, Sherry, I have a few questions to ask you. You'll answer them honestly, right? Right, right. Good. Lionel nodded in satisfaction. It would be a shame if the stories of you and your partner didn't add up, right? Hearing this, Sherry's trembling became several times more violent. He had indeed only planned to tell Lionel part of the truth. But, what if his partner didn't tell the same lie he did? Then, wouldn't he be asking for his own death? This kid was so sinister. He suddenly understood why it was Lionel had separated them. It wasn't so that he could kill him, but rather so that they would have no idea what story the other told. Like this, if they wanted to live, they would have no choice but to say the truth because the truth was the only thing they could guarantee the other would know. Having thought this far, any thoughts of struggle the man had suddenly crumbled. He was a member of the Brazinger clan, how could his will really be so fragile? Unlike those who grew up in Earth's common society, they from hidden families had completely different upbringings. They had been ready for the descent of the metamorphosis since long ago and had begun training since their birth. That included him despite the fact he was only from a branch family. Much of his fear had just been an act to get Lionel to lower his guard, maybe then he could find a chance to escape. But, who knew this teenage boy would be so cunning? Seeing Sherry's flickering gaze, Lionel grinned, causing the former to shudder. My name is Jian, my name is Jian. Please forgive me. Lionel laughed at this. So this Jian was trying to make fun of him by having him call him Sherry? What a conniving fellow indeed. Jian shivered. He had no idea if his partner would expose his name as a lie, so how could he continue to hold back? Good. Lionel walked to the bathhouse that held the soothing waters pool and threw Jian against the tiles. Then, he found a stool and sat down. Jian's shivering grew fiercer. This time, he didn't have to fake it. What place could be more convenient for clearing up a dead body in comparison to a bathroom? Since we're both on the same page, there's really no problem, right? I can see that you're not a useless person, so you already know that everything I ask you, I will ask your partner. Be sure to be honest with me. After all, I may not have a great ability, but the one thing I do have is a great memory. Jian nodded outwardly, but inwardly, he was cursing. Didn't have a great ability? He took them both down before they even knew what was happening. They didn't even have a chance to use their abilities before their worlds went black. How was this not having a great ability? Alright, first question. Did that monocle-wearing bastard come here with you? Jian's eyes widened. The killing intent coming from Lionel enveloped him completely, causing his heart to shudder. This young man knew about their young lord? What relationship did he have with him? Could he be from one of the other hidden families? Did they catch on to their young lord's plans? According to the agreement, only the younger generation of their family's main branches could interact with the world until the fourth dimensional metamorphosis was complete, so could this kid be a young lord from another hidden family? Chapter 175. I'll take that as a yes. Lionel's icy voice woke Jian from his thoughts. He could only shut his mouth, keeping his mumbling to himself. He didn't know what his young lord had done to piss this young man off so much, but he could tell that he should refrain from asking. What did you come here for? Jian gulped. Our young lord didn't tell us much. All we know is that there's a force crystal mine and that the young lord needs it for some reason. How did you get in here through the beasts? Is there another entrance to the hive? Jian's gaze flashed with a peculiar light. But, remembering that Lionel would ask this same question to his partner, he could only throw all thoughts of lying to the back of his mind. Those beasts are under the control of young lord. What? Lionel couldn't hide his shock. At the same time, a cold sweat permeated his back. That monocle-wearing bastard actually had such an ability? That's impossible. Lionel remembered very clearly that he had already asked the dictionary to read out his ability. From what Lionel remembered, their young lord's ability was of the SS grade. He had the ability to change the genetic information of a target. Judging by the fact his subordinates were men, Lionel assumed that in order to change this genetic information, he needed to take it from another source. But, none of this had anything to do with controlling beasts. Could it be that his ability evolved? Or could it be part of his original ability? Or maybe it was someone under his command who had such an ability. Lionel's mind was spinning. The level of danger such a fact brought was unimaginable. With the control of 6, now 5, elite S-grade threats, Simeon was practically invincible. And, there was no telling if he had other beasts following along with him now. Lionel didn't believe that he would really enter without the slightest hint of protection. While Lionel was thinking, Jian didn't dare to even breathe too loudly. The aura coming off the boy in front of him made him shiver to his core. He has the ability to control beasts? How long has he had this ability for? Lionel's question didn't make sense on the surface, but while his mind was wandering, he caught onto the faint inkling of something. If his thoughts were correct, a lot of things would suddenly make sense. It should be recent. The young lord has been running a lot of experiments lately, trying to iron out the kinks in this ability. He only perfected it a few weeks ago. Lionel's eyes narrowed. The gorilla man who attacked the Slayer Legion at the shore that day. That was him, right? Jian was shocked. Seeing this, Lionel didn't need him to answer, he knew it was the truth. The matters of that day hadn't made any sense to him before. Why would a man with an grade threat level throw his life away so randomly? He attacked Damien's units seemingly without cause or purpose, leading to his eventual death. But, after that, they couldn't find any clues about him. Not only was there not a shred of anything on his person, he wasn't recognized as having a grudge with anyone in the Slayer Legion either. None of it made any sense, but what if one looked at it from a different angle? What if that man was just a guinea pig? What if he was Simeon's way of testing whether or not he could force others to throw their lives away at his command? The more Lionel thought, the colder the chill in his heart became. This Simeon really deserved death. At the same time, there was a hint of fear that blossomed in Lionel. Such an ability, it was too treacherous. If Simeon could really manipulate one's genes such that they had to obey his every command, just what kind of power could he wield if he was allowed to run amok? What would happen if Aina had really landed in his hands? He needs to die. A frigid aura permeated the bathhouse. Lionel had already sentenced Simeon to death. He wouldn't allow that bastard to leave this hive alive. How close are you all to finding the path to the force eruption? Jian coughed, clearing his throat. We've only explored about 30% of the entrances, but the deepest one only goes about 50 meters below the surface. The young lord told us to mark down any unique caverns we found and report to him in a week. Lionel's sneer deepened. What kind of protection does that bastard have? The young lord has his elite guards with him. They've all been genetically enhanced. Not a single one is weaker than an S-grade threat. There are 9 of them and they follow him around everywhere. Even when we split up, it was only us ordinary guards that left the group. The rest remained with him. Lionel's eyes narrowed. So many S-grade threats was definitely beyond his means. And, from what Jian said, that was their floor. Who was to say there weren't a few beyond that? For the first time, Lionel felt frustrated with his ability. He was maybe the only person on Earth with an ability that surpassed the SSS grade, but because it was only auxiliary, the amount of strength it provided him was limited. If his ability was of the same grade but of the offensive nature instead, just how much power would he have? Lionel really didn't want to let that bastard go, but the more he grilled Jian about the protection his young lord had, the more he realized that he couldn't take Simeon lightly. The most ironic part was that this was likely his fault. A couple months ago, when he first met Simeon, he hadn't had this kind of protection around him. That bullet Lionel almost put through his skull is probably precisely the reason he was so cautious now. Chapter 176. Lionel grilled Jian with several more questions, then knocked him out and dragged him back into the lab setting. Without a word to his partner, he threw him into one of the snow globes, causing no small shock to the square-jawed man. Not wanting to end up like Jian, how could he not go all out in an attempt to satisfy Lionel? But the truth remained the same. In the end, he too was knocked out once more and thrown into a snow globe. Lionel took a deep breath and sat down, his mind running. Though he could have asked the two about Aina's past, he decided against it. This was something he wanted Aina to tell him herself. It just wouldn't feel the same if someone else had to tell him. Plus, he wanted to respect her boundaries. That said, even aside from that, the heavy pressure Simeon brought him was beyond his imagination. What a joke he was. He had a Tier 3 bronze ability, but he was being pushed into a corner by a Tier 8 black ability. He was sure that if his father knew, he would never hear the end of it. Lionel shook his head, staring blankly into space. After a while, his vacant eyes gained a steely coldness. I'm certain that Simeon's ability didn't originally have anything related to control. The reason he can now is because he's mastered his ability to the point of squeezing out all of its potential, eventually allowing him to gain this new branch ability. I don't believe for a second that he can do something that I can't. The branch abilities of Lionel's main ability seemed to have awoken randomly. First it was Dream World, then it was Dream Sculpt. On the surface, both appeared without rhyme or reason, but was this really the case? Dream World appeared to him when he really wanted to calculate the best orientation of his force nodes. This will eventually allow him to gain his ability to simulate matters in his mind. Dream Sculpt appeared when he wanted to find a way to make use of the treasures he wasn't allowed to take outside of the zone. This will eventually allow him the ability to ingrain perfect and permanent thoughts into his dream world. There was even the third ability he only recently named, Dream Clone. That ability was birthed when he really wanted to learn the primitive man's combat style as quickly as possible. This allowed him to split his mind and learn the same technique many times faster. Every time he needed an ability within his means, it felt as though he could produce it as long as these things fell within the purview of his dream world. Simeon's ability was a wake-up call to Lionel. He realized now that abilities weren't immutable things. They were made to grow and evolve along with their host. Why else would Lionel's ability still be growing even now? It was likely that it would still grow into the future. Lionel took a deep breath. That's right, I need to open myself up to more possibilities. Lionel shook his head furiously. To think that he really almost had thoughts of letting that bastard off for now. Absolutely not. He would make this hive Simeon's grave. After a while, Lionel stood. I have so many materials and even more beast crystals. If I can't make something to get out of this situation, I might as well not go and find Aina at all. Lionel had already decided. There would be 3 keys to his success. First, he would definitely find the path to the force eruption faster. There was most definitely an even greater treasure trove waiting for him. Second, he wouldn't hesitate any longer. He would form his 7th and 8th node. Continually doubting himself wouldn't get him anywhere. Maybe after doing this, he would find some clues about his 9th node. If worse came to worst, he would just abandon all of his force nodes. Though there was a massive taboo against doing so, the price was comparatively shallow for those in the lowest 3rd dimension. Only after stepping into the 4th or higher would abandoning one's force nodes become akin to a death sentence without incredibly special circumstances. And third, Lionel's mind drifted toward the first dream sculpt he ever made. It seemed like a simple golden staff, missing its flag. But Lionel knew quite well the kind of devastation this thing could cause. Lionel knew better than to use this staff to control humans. He had seen how badly Joan ended up with his own 2 eyes. And, back then, she had only been controlling normal humans. By extension, Lionel also knew that controlling high-ranking beasts with it would be foolish as well. Those beast kings had already awoken their intelligence and thus had strong wills of their own. If Lionel tried to take control of them, his ending would be just like Joan's. However, what about those weaker beasts who were only following the beast kings out of fear for their power? Just how quickly had the bear beasts beneath the bear king abandoned him after he died? According to Jian and his partner, Quinn, Simeon should have only taken control of the beast kings then used them as a proxy to control the other beast hordes. Plus, those beast kings definitely had their hands full holding off the tide of beasts coming from the ocean even as Lionel stood here. In that case, Lionel smiled coldly. If Simeon thought of using the beast hordes against him, he would be in for a rude awakening. Out on the sea, the commanders of the Eastern and Southern Lookout were still fighting for their lives. Though, those with Commander Violet Rain were definitely faring much better. I did it. I managed to get a message through. Mellow Trees roared with happiness. He never thought he would have over such a simple matter. Violet Rain's smile bloomed. Though they didn't get a response because the link was swiftly cut off again, this much was enough. Now, they just had to wait. What they forgot to consider was the fact the one in charge of their southern lookout now was Hacker Hutch. Who knew what maddening ways that senile old man would respond to such a call for help? Chapter 177. A week later, Lionel stepped out from the segmented cube. His features seemed quite haggard, an unkempt beard gracing his jaw and his messy dirty blonde hair sweeping across his shoulders. But, his eyes remained as sharp as swords. When the youths noticed Lionel's appearance, they all perked up, traces of anticipation painted on their faces. Lionel smiled lightly. I've succeeded. They were simple words, but they alone made the youths feel that a massive burden had been lifted from their chests. There's no time to waste, Lionel said with a confident air. We've already long since decided who would go and who would stay. Let's move out if you're all prepared. The lineup that chose to follow Lionel was quite interesting. Thunderous Clap, Roaring Black Lion and Flowing Wind all stood to move with him. Thunderous Clap's ability was similar to Jian's vibration ability, but much stronger by several levels. The mysterious quake force he used could be considered a force-strengthening deviation, so he would be joining. In addition, Flowing Wind, despite being from the Eastern Lookout, was also willing to help. Her wind elemental force output was a level beyond chasing winds. In addition, she had much more auxiliary applications to her ability, like the power to use wind to scout out her surroundings. So, she was an ideal choice. Finally, there was Roaring Black Lion. Among the remaining youths, he had the strongest defenses. In addition, there was no guarantee they wouldn't run into beasts on their journey. His ability to dampen their strength would be greatly useful. As for the rest of the top rankers, they stayed behind to protect the group from any unforeseen circumstances. It was simply impossible for them to take so many with them. With that, the group of 4 set off. We're going to cross over into another network of tunnels. I found this place while I was looking for ores previously. Lionel explained as he quickly made his way toward the hole he had created a week prior. He knew that he was running out of time. Much of the reason he left Pisces and the others behind was because he was afraid of this hole being found. According to Jian and Quinn, they were meant to report in a week. When they didn't report as they were meant to, Simeon would most definitely check in on the network of tunnels they were assigned to. By then, there was no guarantee that this hole wouldn't be found. It wasn't long before Lionel had led their group of 4 to the hole, crossed to the other side, and diligently covered it back up again. After he was done, he dashed forward again, snaking through the tunnels as though the map of their pathways was tattooed to the back of his hand. Soon, he made it to his destination, the point with the most direct path to the Force Crystal Mine. Lionel came to a sudden stop at a seemingly ordinary wall and turned back toward Thunderous Clap, Roaring Black Lion and Flowing Wind. Before we go, I have something to tell you 3. I didn't tell the others because I didn't want them to panic, but it's best you 3 know in advance. The 3 looked toward Lionel. Seeing his serious expression, they too became serious. Would things not be so simple? There is another group of people in here aside from us. In fact, earlier, I had captured and interrogated 2 of them. It's very possible that we could run into them. I believe that we're ahead of them, but it's best to be cautious. I suspect that there might be another path toward the Force Crystal Mine, I'm just not entirely certain. I just have a feeling that the valleys weren't created without reason. The 3 youths frowned. The complex network of valleys was precisely the reason they could only enter the center of the island through one passageway. They wrapped around the center of the island such that there was only one path forward. Even beyond that, Flowing Wind actually had no ability to fly over it. She felt that the force was incredibly volatile in that area, making it difficult for her to steady her ability properly. When she realized this, she hadn't dared to continue forward, lest she fall to her death. If the valleys were the result of some odd phenomenon related to the Force Crystal Mine, their odd attributes would be much easier to accept. Only when the 3 nodded seriously did Lionel flip his palm, causing many things to appear. First, each one of you take these. Lionel handed each of them silvery green mouthpieces that looked somewhat like a cross between a flute and a whistle. These are my creations. I made them out of Whispering Breeze, Oregon. They're only Tier 1 black-grade treasures, but they allow you to breathe under water and earth for 3 hours. After that, you'll need to allow it to recharge for half an hour before you can use it again. The 3 nodded in understanding, watching as Lionel continued to take out 9 total resplendent blue scales. These are another set of my creations, 3 to the each of you. They're refined from the koi fish's scales. They could be able to form an artificial force skin that melds and amplifies with your own. By my calculations, they should each be able to last half an hour under the full pressure of the force eruption. I'm not sure how long it will take us to stop the force eruption. We'll have to play it by ear. Lionel took a deep breath and turned back to face the wall, putting the silver mouthpiece between his lips. Stick close to me. Though his words had come out in a mumble, they still managed to understand him. Lionel could only roll his eyes when he felt 2 soft mounds of flesh press against his back. Who else could it be if not Flowing Wind? Could this be considered sexual harassment? Lionel didn't have time to spend on the matter as an intricate ring on his finger glowed. Just like this, the seemingly solid wall before him became akin to a curtain of mud. He pushed through it with slightly more difficulty than it would take to walk underwater. Still, it wasn't too bad. The only disadvantage was that he couldn't see anything and his internal sight was severely restricted in this kind of environment. However, he could rely on his obscene calculation abilities to maintain his sense of direction with relative ease. Like this, the 4 youths formed a train, the 3 to Lionel's back closely following by linking their arms. What was especially magical, though, was that the wall of earth they left the range of reverted back to their original state soon after. Though Lionel could see nothing but a vast darkness before him, he could feel himself getting closer. He kept his hand in the lead, ready for it to enter clear air once again. And, a moment later, that was exactly what happened. Lionel felt the resistance against his hands suddenly vanish and came to a grinding halt. Arg! Lionel wanted to groan, but he kept it in. He felt a sharp pain in his hand as though it could be lacerated to minced meat in but another few moments. Without hesitation, he pressed his first koi fish scale against his body, causing a radiant blue to cover him like a thin layer of skin. He had already long since taken off his chain necklace, saving it for a critical moment. After this, using his hand, he extended his soul force forward, stretching his internal sight outward. What he saw made him grind his teeth in anger. There was a vast underground space. Its ceilings were at least 100 meters tall and it was over a kilometer from end to end. It was filled with shimmering crystals so bright that had Lionel been looking at them with his eyes, he was sure he would have to squint. Of course, all of these dimensions were just Lionel's approximate guesses. The force was so volatile that his internal sight was incredibly fuzzy. The sharp range was severely reduced, causing his calculations to be lacking. What had made him angry, though, was the fact that there was someone who had gotten here before him. More accurately, there was a beast that had gotten here before him. Lionel's hand had appeared near the ceiling of the wide space. So, if he stepped out now, he would fall 100 meters to his death. Down below, there was an adorable creature, taking a nap without a care in the world. Its fur was a lustrous black, its whiskers and small nose twitching as though it was having a particularly good dream. Its body was long and considered of its proportions. It had such a small head, but it was easily 1.5 feet from head to toe. This adorable creature was actually a little black-furred mink. But, despite having never seen it in its true form before, Lionel couldn't help but grind his teeth. This little bastard was definitely the beast that had been harassing him for so long. Chapter 178. Lionel suppressed his annoyance in his heart. He would definitely deal with that annoying little mink, but he also had to be cautious. For one, that little mink could somehow sleep within that torrent of energy without any problems while he had simply stretched out a hand into it yet almost couldn't withstand the pain. Secondly, after so many days of battle with the little mink, Lionel knew that it most definitely wasn't simple to deal with. He even felt that its danger level was a level beyond the Beast Kings outside. He was thankful that all of their exchanges had lasted for a short time, or else maybe he would have been on the losing end far more times than he wanted to admit. Why can it just sleep there so easily? Didn't the dictionary say the only way to survive in this environment was force skin? It doesn't look like that little bastard is using it. The little mink seemed to have a cloud of black fog perpetually hanging around its body, but this wasn't exactly like force skin at all. It must be its innate ability. That means its dark element force strengthening deviation might also comes from its innate ability. Lionel took a deep breath. He couldn't consider this any longer. Now that he knew there was this beast guarding the force crystal mine, he knew that he had to take it out. He didn't know why, but this little mink loved to attack him. Maybe the little guy thought it was a joke, but Lionel's life had been on the line every time. He couldn't take any chances. After making a decision, Lionel started slowly descending. He had appeared too high. If he stepped out now, he would just fall to his death. But, if he went too low, his treasure would likely stop working. The entire floor and much of the sides of the open space were covered with force crystals radiating resplendent lights. All the way here, Lionel had to navigate around or veins because he knew his treasure wouldn't work against high-level minerals. Obviously, the same went for force crystals. Unable to communicate with the others, Lionel had no choice but to make an explosive move. With flowing wind positioned right behind him, he believed that she would be able to stop their fall with her ability, albeit shakily considered how volatile the force here was. Lionel leapt out from the wall. Force and sharp winds whipped against his body as he fell down toward the sleeping black-furred mink. With a flip of his palms, 2 pistols appeared, both outfitted with harpoons. This time, he had no intention of holding back. If he could kill this beast before it woke up, that would be for the best. Bang! Bang! Lionel's gaze lit up. He knew his shots hit the mark. And, from start to finish, the little mink hadn't moved. In fact, it seemed that his shots were so powerful that it directly blasted apart the platform of force crystals the little mink had been sleeping on too. But, this made sense. After all, compared to those massive beasts outside, this little guy was really small. It was no surprise Lionel's attack went right through it like that. Lionel landed heavily on the ground, a jolt of pain shooting through his legs as his bluish force skin fluctuated wildly beneath the pressure of the force eruption. He shook the stinging sensation out of his lower half. It seemed that his fall had quite an impact on him. He should have definitely used his treasure shoes. But, he had been saving them in case the little mink woke up in time and made a move on him. If that happened, he would have needed his shoes to dodge, or else he would have been a sitting duck in the air. However, Lionel could have never expected what he witnessed next. When he looked up, he was stunned silent. The little mink was still there, sleeping its time away as though nothing had happened. The two darts Lionel had shot out were still there as well. One went through the little mink's head and the other went through its body. However, it was like the little mink was an illusion or in a completely different reality. Its body seemed corporeal, but Lionel's attack went through it as though it had no substance at all, almost as though this was just a projection and not a living creature. What the hell? Lionel's heart tightened. At that moment, Flowing Wind unsteadily dropped to the ground, carrying Roaring Black Lion and Thunderous Clap along with her. Her control over her ability was extremely poor in this place, but it was at least enough to slow their descent. Either way, Lionel hadn't brought her here for her combat prowess, but rather to help in quickening the maturity of the Force Crystal Core. Why'd you kill such an adorable little guy? Flowing Wind reprimanded Lionel without the slightest hint of her previous lusty personality. In the blink of an eye, she had suddenly become a mother hen protecting her chicks. Lionel almost couldn't refrain from lashing out. Adorable? This little bastard had almost killed him who knows how many times. After a while, Flowing Wind and the others also noticed the oddity. If such a small creature was hit with such force, shouldn't it be a rain of blood and guts by now? Why did it seem like Lionel's darts had been embedded into its body? It's incorporeal? Is it fake? Thunderous Clap muttered. I don't think it's fake. Lionel said slowly. But don't be fooled by its appearance. This little thing almost killed me several times. The eyes of the three youths widened. Almost killed Lionel? Which of them didn't know how powerful Lionel was? Yet, such a small beast was a danger to him? Hearing such words, they could only put their guards up. I didn't get a chance to do this before because it was too fast, but maybe now. Tell me about its abilities. The dictionary appeared in Lionel's palm as his eyes narrowed with seriousness. Ping evolved life form detected. Simplified title, Mink, state, evolved. Evolving, abilities, Ping generating nomenclature. Shadow World, an ability that takes control of the world hidden from the stars. Evaluating power, Ping, evolution stage, Elite Tier 9 Black. Chapter 179. Lionel involuntarily held his breath. This description. It was the simplest he had ever seen. It was also the most vague he had ever seen. The only description he had seen that carried this level of vagueness was his own. His own only became more detailed after he began using the dictionary to document his ability, which is why it now had a breakdown of all his abilities from Dream World to Dream Clone. But initially, calculative mind, an ability capable of simplifying the complex. This was what the dictionary had first told him about his ability. It never said anything about his Dream World, Dream Sculpt or Dream Clone ability. Aside from himself, he had never seen an ability as simply explained as the little mink's shadow world. But, what also shocked Lionel was the state of the little mink. Not only did it say evolved, but it also said evolving. The little mink's ability was already classified with the elite tier 9 black level. If it evolved, wouldn't it cross over into the bronze level just like Lionel? Lionel took a deep breath to steady his beating heart. Unlike him, the little mink's ability seemed exceptional for combat. Lionel couldn't even touch it despite the fact it was sleeping right in front of him. How was it even possible to do anything to this little guy? Just with this ability alone, the little mink was untouchable in fourth-dimensional worlds. Only under the suppression of a fifth-dimensional world would its ability begin to show some weaknesses. But, considering it was currently evolving into the bronze tiers, it seemed that this wouldn't be true for long. Lionel decided to leave his darts in place. He didn't dare to approach the little mink too closely anymore. But, he also knew that it was simply impossible for them to just leave now. Their success would decide the life and death of tens of people. How long will it take this little thing to finish evolving? Lionel asked. Ping, replying to Seed, 3:21:51:05, 3 days, 21 hours, 51 minutes and 5 seconds. Hopefully that's enough. Lionel chose to go with the assumption that the little mink would stay asleep for as long as it was evolving. In that case, maybe they would have enough time to help the Force Crystal mine mature. Let's hurry, Lionel said, receiving the agreement of the others. The four youths turned their attention toward the raging tempest of white, gushing force toward the center of the wide space. The mine was over a kilometer in width and length. Of that space, the geyser took up barely 20 meters of width. But, its presence was imposing. It was an odd feeling. Unlike geysers of water, this force eruption hadn't made a single sound after its initial burst. It bore a hole through the network of tunnels above it and remained completely silent, even to the point the youths could easily chat. Alright, roaring black lion, you'll have to protect flowing wind. You all know what to do, right? The youths nodded. Thunderous Clap had a force cultivating technique and had formed 4 nodes. So, his ability to keep up his force skin was relatively better. But, Flowing Wind had yet to do so for whatever reason, so she needed the protection of Roaring Black Lion. This was definitely a testament to how great her ability was. We just pour our force strengthening deviations in, right? Sounds simple enough. Flowing Wind mumbled. But, it was clear that she wasn't very confident. Stealing their wills, the youths moved forward, approaching the geyser of white from different angles. The moment they crossed the barrier, they realized that things were completely out of their expectations. Let alone the towering danger they expected, it almost felt as though they were walking through a spray of sparkling water on the hottest of summer days. However, instead of making him feel more relaxed, Lionel's heart clenched as he pushed his way toward the core. Though he disparaged the dictionary sometimes, how could he not trust something his father had left for him? His father was the one person who he trusted with his everything. Even if the things he left behind would sometimes tease him in unexpected ways, they wouldn't ever truly put him in danger. Since his father's dictionary put so much emphasis on how dangerous force eruptions were, how could Lionel ever take them lightly? The fact things seemed so calm and even relaxing made his hair stand on end. They say that there were forms of death where one would feel incomparably relaxed near the end. Some said that there was no better euphoria than drowning. Something about this force eruption reminded Lionel of such things. Soon, Lionel had made it to the force crystal core. Without a better descriptor, he could only say that it was beautiful. It was the most perfect sphere Lionel had ever seen. It stood amidst an array of force crystals that looked like the petals of a blooming flower. Despite the fact it was the cause of such a shocking event, it was completely still. It was almost impossible to tell that it was the source of all of this at all. It radiated an assortment of colors, shimmering a resplendent rainbow. However, if one looked closely, it was possible to see golden lines being slowly drawn just beneath its surface. These lines seemed to exude an ancient mystery and were even somewhat more resplendent than even the rainbow colors of the force crystal core. If it wasn't hidden beneath the core's surface, it would definitely easily outshine its radiance. Those must be the natural force arts. Lionel looked up to see 3 pairs of eyes looking toward him solemnly. It seemed that they felt this matter shouldn't be so simple either. Lionel narrowed his eyes and took a step forward, lightly touching the core with a finger. Immediately, his expression changed as he quickly retracted his hand. But it was still too late. The force skin protecting his hand burst. Soon after it, the skin on his left hand splintered and shattered into a rain of blood. Even the bones of his fingers were visible to see. Lionel's force quickly surged, pushing the torrent of force rampaging around within him out with brute force. By the time his heart settled down and he looked toward the force crystal core with a solemn expression, all he could feel was a spine-tingling pain from his hand. Chapter 180. Lionel's face slightly twisted in pain. No matter how used he was to injuries by now, the feeling of having his hand practically explode from the inside out left him wanting to cry out. The other three youths looked toward him with fear evident in their eyes. It was just a simple touch, but Lionel's ending had actually been so terrible. If he held on for just a fraction of a second longer, just how much worse would his injuries be? Lionel took several deep breaths. Maybe the worst part about all of this was the loss of his hand. A force crafter's hands were the most important part of their body. With his left hand in this state, it simply wouldn't be possible to craft anything. I'm too reckless. Lionel clenched his jaw. Retreat. Lionel ordered this the moment he saw how helpless the situation was. That break in his force skin had shaved off more than half the remaining time the force skin treasure he had forged had. It wouldn't be long before it shattered completely. By then, there was no telling how horrible his ending would be. However, just when he wanted to retreat, Lionel's expression changed. It had been so easy to walk in, but he found that the way out made him feel as though he was walking against quicksand. Lionel's expression immediately became ugly. What the hell was going on? What's going on? I feel like I can't take a step back no matter how much I want to. Roaring Black Lion's voice held a rare instance of trepidation and fear. This was the very last thing they expected to happen. Why was it so easy to enter but not easy to leave? It seems I've underestimated this force eruption again. Lionel smiled bitterly. There were all sorts of natural traps in the world, even before the metamorphosis. All of them were easy to enter but difficult to leave. A Venus flytrap wouldn't have any qualms about allowing a fly onto its petals, but would it so easily allow one to leave? A beast wouldn't hesitate to allow its prey into its mouth, but would it so easily release it? This trap in particular reminded Lionel of a phenomenon that could happen in rivers and dams. Anyone swimming near a dam would be asking for death. The interaction between the rushing water suddenly met by an immovable force would cause a pattern of currents that would easily allow a human in, but make it impossible for them to leave. The number of people who had died to such a phenomenon were too many to count. Lionel had just never expected that the flow of force here would be able to replicate such a thing. Lionel smiled bitterly. Sorry guys. It seems I was still a bit reckless. Lionel sighed. He knew that once again this was a case of the dictionary being very specific with its answers. He asked about how to mature a force crystal core ahead of time, but hadn't asked anything about something like this. The three youths couldn't help but be disappointed. But, how mad could they be? It wasn't as though Lionel had sent them into this danger alone. He had stepped forward first and had even been willing to retreat when things weren't going well. This was something completely out of their expectations. Don't worry. Lionel said firmly after a moment. I promise to take you all out of here. The resolution in Lionel's voice shocked them. They hadn't expected that even now, he would still take responsibility. Usually, someone with as much power as him would definitely not have the time to care about them now. Without another word, Lionel directly sat on the ground, entering a meditative state. He weakly supported his left hand on his lap, doing his best to ignore the pain. I have almost 30 koi fish scales. Each of them can provide 30 minutes of protection. Between the four of us, that's enough for a bit over 3 hours and a half. The three youths looked toward Lionel, then looked at one another. There were clear hints of despair on their faces, but what could they do? Thunderous Clap tried to fight his way out, throwing out thunderous punches that rocked the air, but he found himself sliding back with every strike. Flowing Wind and Roaring Black Lion tried their hands at it too. In fact, the former had the greatest shot and even almost succeeded, trying to ride the flow of force. But in the end, just when it looked like she might succeed, she was blasted backward. Had it not been for Roaring Black Lion catching her before she landed on the Force Crystal core, her outcome would have been even sorrier. Lionel's mind spun. However, no matter how hard he thought, everything pointed in a singular direction: force strengthening deviations. The only way to overwhelm force was with force of greater quantity or quality. Right now, he couldn't spare thoughts toward maturing the Force Crystal core. Wasting stamina on it would just make it so that they were less likely to survive. With only a little over 3 hours, every small bit of stamina could decide life and death. I need to improve my light elemental force or my spear force. Lionel's eyes flashed open. He pushed forward his only good remaining hand, stabbing out toward the edge of the force eruption's influence. But what he saw left him feeling helpless. Even with the amplification of his spear force, his Call of the Wind only traveled a meter before being shattered completely. Taking a deep breath, Lionel attempted to fuse his light elemental force into the attack. It wasn't a perfect fusion, but it was barely enough to gain a small amplification. He pierced out once more, but the result was just as depressing. It barely passed the 2.5 meter mark before being crushed. That was still almost a full 8 meters from the edge they needed to escape from. The closer to escaping the energy fluctuations it was, the harder it is to cross. The 1 to 2 meter distance was at least twice as difficult to cross as the 0 to 1 meter distance. I need to improve. Lionel could only turn his hopes back to the dictionary. It said that there were levels beyond, right? Chapter 181. Lionel turned a complicated glance toward the dictionary in his hands. Tell me about the levels of force strengthening deviations. Ping. Force strengthening deviations are divided by quality and type. Type can range from weapon types to elemental types, while quality is decided by evolution potential and range of ability, also known as evolution branches. Evolution potential, the potential for improvement. This is decided by the amplification ability of a force strengthening deviation. All force strengthening deviations have the ability to reach the pinnacle, but the amount of amplification they provide varies. Evolution branches, these are the number of routes a force strengthening deviation can take. Not all of the same type and subtype are born equal. There are differences in strength between spear forces and even light elemental forces. Lionel's brow furrowed. There was so much information. He didn't know if it was worth it to know all of it. After all, he only had 3 hours left. He had to make a decision. Sitting here listening to a history lesson on force strengthening deviations would just be asking for death. Tell me about my light elemental force specifically. Ping. The light elemental force seed has comprehended comes from a lineage factor. This is somewhat different from a force strengthening deviation comprehended naturally or awakened through an ability. A naturally comprehended force strengthening deviation is limited by either one's comprehension or the source one has used to comprehend it. Lionel was confused by this for a moment, but after a while he understood. By source the dictionary was referring to natural sources of force strengthening deviations. For example, if one found a battleground and there were many spear force scars along the ground, it would be possible to comprehend spear force from them. But, one would be limited by the expertise of the expert that carved the scars in the first place. Of course, one could also naturally comprehend spear force on their own, much like Hutch comprehended blade force. In that case, it was on one's own shoulders to improve and evolve one's spear force. A force strengthening deviation awakened through an ability would be limited by the evolution stage of one's ability. But, Seed's force strengthening deviation is limited by the lineage factors of your lineage factor. The origin of Seed's light elemental force is the Snowy Star Owl lineage factor. Lionel's heart suddenly skipped a beat. Time dilated and he could feel that his breathing had slowed to a crawl. In that moment, his eyes became dim as though he had been trapped in an illusion. In the beginning, all he saw was darkness. But, after a while, he could faintly see a small dot in the distance that radiated a bright light. He blinked just a single time, but the moment his vision cleared, the light had completely covered the range he could see. The sight was incomparably beautiful. A bird with eyes radiating with wisdom and feathers as white as snow looked down toward him. Its golden irises didn't have a hint of disdain or loftiness. Rather, it looked down as though a senior appreciating a junior. The gentleness touched Lionel's heart. So, a mighty call left the owl's beak as it flapped its wings once more, vanishing from Lionel's sight. But even still, the image continued to replay in his mind. And, as time began to regain its previous pace, Lionel's heart followed and quickened many times over. When Lionel's dull gaze regained its light, he found that his breathing had quickened and he was drenched from head to toe in sweat. Wow, snowy star owl. What kind of creature was that? Lionel had no idea. But he somehow felt that it was incomparably majestic. Lionel wasn't sure how his lineage factor stacked up to other light elemental lineage factors, but what he did know was that this lineage factor made him feel extremely comfortable. The snowy star owl is known especially for its speed, wisdom, and miracle healing. As such, Seed's light elemental lineage factor can be considered to have three main branches of evolution. The first branch is simply known as the movement evolution. Among force strengthening deviation, light elemental force only loses to space elemental force in this regard. However, within the speed sub-branch of the movement evolution branch, the light element is unmatched. The second branch is known as the support evolution branch. The wisdom sub-branch and the healing sub-branch both fall under this category. Both sub-branches can only be effectively used when combined with one's other lineage factors. Meaning one's level of light elemental force can thus unlock lineage factor abilities and techniques to be used as one. Wisdom. Healing. Lionel didn't know what these sub-branches were, but this evolution branch concept really reminded him the evolution trees of a role-playing game. Was that how lineage factors worked as well? He had thought that his light elemental force had exceptionally good penetrative abilities, but judging by the words of the dictionary, this wasn't its main ability. Why do I feel that my light elemental force had good penetrative ability? Ping, replying to Seed, this is a result of Seed's spear domain lineage factor. Lionel furrowed his brows. Isn't my spear domain lineage factor much weaker than my light element lineage factor? Ping, replying to Seed, you're an idiot. Hearing these words, not only did Lionel's face darken, but so did the other three youths who happened to be nearby him. Even in the situation, the sudden odd words almost made them burst into laughter. Lionel could tell that the "you're an idiot" part was very lifelike. It seemed that it was yet another recording left by his father, but this time, it was just a short message. The strength of the spear domain lineage factor is in its ability to combine countless disciplines into one. This is why the spear domain heirloom is filled with spears, each tied to a different consciousness and each with a completely different style. Only by combining many disciplines into one will the spear domain lineage factor truly show its might. The reason Seed's light elemental force seems to have great penetrative abilities is because of the effect of Seed's spear domain lineage factor. It has integrated Seed's light elemental force somewhat, giving it such an ability. Also, though attacking is not a main ability of the snowy star owl, it is still an elite 6-dimensional mythical beast. It would not be too weak in this regard. To lower dimensions, its attack ability can be considered godly. After hearing all of this, Lionel finally understood. The penetrative ability of his light elemental force occurred due to the influence of his spear domain lineage factor. But, since he had looked down on his spear domain lineage factor, he never actively tried to look into its secrets, thus inadvertently suppressing it. If that's the case, Lionel's blood rumbled, a spear appearing in his hand. Without even getting up, his eyes flashed as he pierced forward. This time, He felt that the integration of his spear force and light elemental force had risen by several degrees. Lionel's eyes glowed with a fierce light. 4 meters. It wasn't only him who was excited, but Flowing Wind practically pounced into his arms and gave him a kiss. There really was hope. Chapter 182. After the initial bout of excitement, Lionel immediately calmed himself. What was there to be proud about? He had only touched 4 meters, there were still 6 more to go. And, it had now become even more obvious to him that the difficulty of crossing that distance doubled with every meter he passed. The fact he had directly jumped from 2.5 meters to 4 was a testament to just how great his spear domain lineage factor was, but that was all. Was it even possible to improve enough to cross the remaining distance? The other youths seemed to realize this as well. So, their smiling expressions soon faded. Handsome, hurry up and improve some more. I'm too young and beautiful to die. Flowing Wind said this as though joking around, but there was a well-hidden fear in her tone. It wasn't something that Lionel would miss. Lionel took a deep breath. You 3 enter my spatial treasure. It should buy us more time. Lionel wasn't confident in the segmented cube's defensive ability. This wasn't because he was doubting its peak prowess, but rather because it was still in Phase 1. In Phase 1, it was essentially still limited to third-dimensional abilities. So, it was impossible for its abilities to be too grand. However, if these 3 youths entered the segmented cube and he placed it in his spatial bracelet, then he only needed to activate 1 force skin to protect them all. Like this, his less than 4-hour time limit would be over 13 hours. The 3 youths looked at each other and nodded. Here, they were only a burden to Lionel. It would be good if they could help in some way. Lionel sighed a breath of relief and took out the segmented cube. He found that it was frenziedly absorbing the force in the surroundings. At this pace, it might only be a few days before it could accumulate enough to evolve into Phase 2. But, Lionel obviously didn't have this long to wait. Just when Lionel was about to allow the youths in, he suddenly made a pleasant discovery. The segmented cube can't leave this place, but it's still a natural force barrier. Lionel's eyes glowed with excitement. He hadn't put too much hope in the segmented cube. In fact, he had covered it with his force skin when he pulled it out just now. But, what he never expected was that it would actually be capable of forcefully absorbing any force he gave it. It can take volatile force, absorb it, and make it docile. In that case, didn't that mean that Lionel's time limit wasn't limited to 13 or so hours anymore? Lionel grinned as the 3 youths looked toward him in confusion. It seems we don't need to die here today. Before the 3 could ask Lionel what he meant, the segmented cube expanded and enveloped the 3 of them. On the outside, the segmented cube expanded to a 10-meter diameter, hovering in the air above the force crystal core. It shuddered and trembled, bouncing back and forth between the 2 opposing edges of the force geyser, but it eventually managed to reach an equilibrium. Within the abode setting, the 4 youths watched on nervously as a violent earthquake took hold of the world within the segmented cube. They only managed to sigh a breath of relief after everything finally settled into a low rumble. Lionel wasn't any different from them. He too had been worried about the result, but luckily it had all paid off. There are a few rooms here. Feel free to pick one. There's also plenty of food and water. It'll definitely get us out of here. Lionel nodded to the youths. But when they saw the sadness on his expression, they couldn't help but be stunned. This should have been a happy change of events. Why was it that Lionel didn't seem the slightest bit happy? Lionel turned to leave. Flowing Wind wanted to step out and stop him, maybe even try to cheer him up, but she found that 2 sturdy hands had landed on her shoulders, stopping her from moving forward. She was completely stunned to find that both Roaring Black Lion and Thunderous Clap had tacitly agreed to stop her as one. She couldn't even react before Lionel had disappeared from her sight. Why the hell did you 2 stop me? He's our savior, shouldn't we at least say thank you? There's no reason for him to be feeling like that. You don't get it. Roaring Black Lion said with a snort. Even if things worked out in the end, his pride is still wounded. Pride? Flowing Wind's brows furrowed. Though it was blocked beneath her mask, one could imagine that it was quite a lovely sight to see. It's ultimately his fault that things turned out this way. Thunderous Clap spoke. There's even an argument to be made here that we're only alive by a fluke. Even stumbling into the ability of this abode-type treasure was a mistake. What the hell are you saying? We made our own choice to come here with him. Plus, he was in just as much danger as us. Only a bastard would blame him for information we all lacked equally. You still don't get it. I don't know what's weighing on Indum Lionel's mind, but whatever it is, he definitely feels like his performance makes him unworthy of meeting those goals. He takes himself to be responsible for our lives. Whether it was coming to this hive or accelerating the maturity of the Force Crystal Core, they were all his ideas. But, he's seemingly made one mistake after another. For a man like him, he definitely feels inadequate. Flowing Wind snorted. If it was just garbage male pride, you should have just said so from the beginning. But he's so handsome and caring at the same time, this lady definitely likes him. Roaring Black Lion and Thunderous Clap looked at one another helplessly. This Flowing Wind girl was definitely too far gone. You're tuning into the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.